I know there are some members who will be late who have been coming from other committees. Members, the minutes of the last meeting, the 26th of February, are at page 6 of your packs. If members are content, I'll sign them into the record.
I'm shown, I think I'm the fiddler's elbow. It says that I arrived and went. Mr. Hussey left during the meeting. Was that Mr. Hussey to the left or Mr. Hussey? On item 4, page 7. At 2:14, I'm showing as left and joined the meeting.
No. Get that amended.
No, I'm good, but I'm not that good.
Okay. In the Lanigan's Ball.
We'll
get that amended, Ross. Members, just before the meeting today, I just want to do some housekeeping rules, also for members of the public gallery. Because this is a witness session and Hansard is here with us today, to keep all mobile phones switched off and not on silent, as they do interfere with the Hansard recording of the session. So I would appreciate if all members could turn off their mobile phones. Members, declaration of interest. Does any member wish to declare an interest in these matters we're discussing here today? Members, we all know our areas of question also, and I advise members to keep any supplementaries brief and clear, and if it is a supplementary, that it's relevant to the question that's been asked prior to your supplementary. I'd like to welcome Mr. Paul Sweeney, the Accounting Officer for the Department of Education, who is here today with his team. Paul, when you make yourself comfortable, you're very welcome, and at any point you could introduce your team to the committee before we get started, if you want to introduce your team.
Well, good afternoon, Chair, members, and thank you. Can I introduce Caroline Gillen, who's Director of Inclusion, Access and Wellbeing, Assistant Secretary in the Department of Education, Dr. Claire Mangan, who's Chief Executive in the Belfast Education Library Board, and Ali Farr, who's the Chief Educational and Welfare Officer, both for the Southern Board and the Western Education Library Board.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Members, you'll find the biographies of all of our witnesses at page 12 to 16 of your electronic packs. Mr. Mike Brennan is also here today, acting on behalf of Fiona Hamill and Kieran, and I just want to point out, as I said to members earlier, we're normally in the Senate chamber for a witness session, but due to other committee commitments in the building, we're here today in room 29, so the usual layout is not the usual. We would normally have the auditor and Miss Fiona Hamilton or Mike Brennan here with us on either side. So again, members, if there's anything you want clarified from the auditor, you will have an opportunity to do so after the witness session. Okay, members, before we proceed with taking evidence, I want to draw your attention that we've just received correspondence from the Department of Education, which has just been tabled this afternoon or today with us. This states that there's 2 errors in the Audit Office report on improving pupil attendance. And they're not the Audit Office errors, they're errors that have come from the Department. I want to point that out. The first relates to a number of cases that were referred to the Education Welfare Service, which resulted in a fine to parents, and this is stated in the report as being 108. It can be found at paragraph 17 on page 7 and paragraph 3.30 on page 40. The second error refers to the number of education supervision orders, which is stated in the report as being 24. This information can also be found on paragraph 17 on page 7 of the report and paragraph 3.30 on page 40. Mr. Sweeney's correspondence provides corrected figures for these 2 points, and a copy of the correspondence received from Mr. Sweeney has only been given to you now, as it has only been received this afternoon. If members want to maybe just have time to look at that. before we go into the evidence session.
Chairperson, could you just very quickly, not read all that again, but just give us the two
Yeah.
figures again?
Yeah, it's paragraph 17 on page 7 and paragraph 3.30 on page 40.
What is the actual number of cases then referred to the educational supervising order?
36, 47,
What is it?
36.
Yeah, it's actually 36 and 47 right across the boards. Yeah. I suppose, firstly, Mr Sweeney, can you explain to the committee how these figures have been reached at this time? And I suppose it was brought to the attention, it could have been brought to the attention of the committee sooner. I mean, obviously, you know, bearing in mind that this report is out some time. The report has been prepared and indeed signed off by your department after it was published or before it was published. So do you want to give a comment on that?
Chair, first of all, I think I owe the committee an apology, unreservedly. Apology to the committee. As you would imagine, we were preparing for today's committee session, evidence session, and in doing so, I wanted to interrogate the figure work, particularly around the number of fines. And in doing so, in preparing for the committee this afternoon, we were not able to substantiate those figures, so I invited through Claire each of the boards to absolutely interrogate those figures again, and I received those figures this morning and got them to the committee as soon as I possibly could before 1 o'clock today.
Okay. Again, and I suppose it's part of why we have you here today. It's about keeping correct data on the system, and I think maybe some members might want to comment on that. Members can tell.
Chairperson, given that we will be focusing on statistics by and large, it certainly is disappointing to find that at the very last moment the department's own figures were incorrect. And not only that, but we're only finding out now as we start our session that we need to make corrections. That certainly doesn't instill any confidence in me that any statistics from the department is reliable.
Okay, Deputy Chairperson, any other comments?
Yeah, just in core what John says, I think that's true. You know, it starts off on the bad foot to start off with. So, you know, anything we're going to hear now, we're going to have to maybe double check or half double check before we can sort of come to a conclusion on it.
Okay, thank you, members. Thank you for that. I concur also. It is disappointing that it's had to be corrected at this late stage of the day when we are taking evidence session here today. And again, I'll reiterate, this is part of the inquiry will be, focusing on data systems and the mechanisms within that about keeping correct data. So, thank you, Mr. Sweeney, for that. We'll move on. I want to start by my line of questioning in terms of the department's progress, Mr. Sweeney, on implementing the recommendations from the 2004 report. It appears to have been, in my opinion, and indeed the opinion of the committees, very slow at best, and some have not been implemented at all. The recommendations coming forward from the 2004 report. While there has been a marginal improvement in overall pupil attendance, there has also been an increase in the level of unauthorised absence. Can you explain why, Mr. Sweeney, in 10 years the department has not yet developed an attendance strategy, despite this being a key recommendation coming out of the last Audit Office report? Why that hasn't happened, and indeed what is the department doing about this?
Well, Chair, thank you. And can I say that I very much welcome the report. It wholly aligns with the department's priorities of raising standards and tackling educational underachievement. And obviously, at the core of the report is the recognition that attendance and educational achievement are inextricably linked. Chair, in terms of preparing a strategy, I accept that the department has not published a strategy for tackling attendance. but we have been operating within a strategic framework in responding to these issues. As you said, there has been a marginal increase in the figures overall, but disappointingly, that area of unauthorised absence remains very, very challenging. During the course of the session this afternoon, I would hope that we will be able to provide evidence to the committee of the steps that we have been taking over a number of years to respond in a strategic way. But importantly, in terms of looking forward, the report has been very timely. It has, within the department, created a new impetus, if I was being self-critical. Although we have been focusing relentlessly on raising attainment, and attainment and attendance are inextricably linked, I feel that we haven't been explicit enough and focused enough and targeted enough around the whole issue of attendance. So I think with the publication of this report, it does give us now a new impetus, a new focus, whereby the department and the boards, in partnership with the schools and parents and communities, can work forward in a more joined-up way. And the first stage will be more proactive engagement now with schools, particularly the schools in the most disadvantaged areas, and then that leading to marshalling all the best practice guidance that we have in then a publication of an agreed strategy.
Okay, so it's a work in progress, basically what you're saying, Mr. Sweeney. Is there a timeline, basically, for that coming forward?
Well, the timeline somewhere between 12 to 18 months, and if I could explain my reasoning for that. The key thing, and one of the key recommendations in the report now, is to more intensely engage with the schools, particularly the schools in the most disadvantaged areas and arguably post-primary, and to work with those schools in terms of identifying best practice and disseminating best practice. It's really important, and this was drawn out in the 2004 report, that targets are not, if you like, top-down. Targets need to be grown from bottom-up. So we must work with schools to realistically assess what would be challenging and realistic targets that schools could set, that boards could set, and then that the department then overall could set on a regional basis. So we've identified the schools that we wish to, in the first instance, engage with. We'll have one substantive round of discussions with schools before the summer. We'll re-engage again in the autumn. In terms of formulating the strategy, it really will then be dependent upon what additional steps will be required over and above the good work that we are involved in. And if, for example, if it was the will of the Assembly that we wanted to take some particularly radical steps that might require legislation, then that will determine, will there have to be a period of consultation on a draft strategy. So this afternoon I would say to the members, we're going to put urgency into this work, but to make sure that it's a substantive document, somewhere between 12 to 18 months. Sure.
Thank you. And that'll bring me on just, and I'm sure other members will come in later, and around the committee visiting Milburn Primary School last week, just in preparation for this session here today. And we saw at first hand how one school was able to tackle a non-attendance under extremely difficult circumstances. The committee, we were extremely impressed about the efforts of the school and how everybody within the school team, staff, engaged with the local community. Early intervention obviously been highlighted as good practice, and early intervention again key. Given that the report also highlights that the absence levels increase as pupils progress through post-primary, surely more needs to be done to tackle the problem early on. So I would imagine that early intervention is within that strategy.
Yes, and again, in terms of the department's overall focus, in terms of raising standards and tackling that cycle of disadvantage, poor attendance, poor outcomes, I mean, members will be aware of the investment that the department has made in early years, right through from Sure Start, preschool, nursery, the importance of primary, the importance of tracking poor attendance, even from the preschool period, certainly tracking poor attendance in primary, because that can be symptomatic of more serious underlying causes. So it really is important that all the partners involved here, right from social services right through the educationists, teachers, leaders in schools and parents and Board of Governors, that we're sharing that intelligence so that there's early identification and early steps can be taken to kind of, if you like, be more preventative.
I understand the due process around, what has to be done in terms of intervention, but what I think we saw at the visit to Millburn was the school first-hand working with parents and the community. And, I suppose keeping within regulation and everything, you have to allow the schools obviously to have a common sense approach to an issue when it does arise. And that may at sometimes mean the school working slightly outside of what the norm would normally be. And I think that is key to a successful outcome and the societal problems that we would have facing families and schools and the whole school community. So I think that we saw that firsthand, and it worked in Millburn. And I would like to hear maybe later on within the inquiry more about that. I have a couple of members looking to get in. I think John indicated, and Paul and Trevor and Alan. John, Deputy Chairperson.
Chairperson, you've quite rightly identified Millburn as a... Sorry, that one?
No.
Millburn as a exemplar material. You will also perhaps recall, Chairperson, that we visited another institution last year.
Yes.
It's called McGilligan Jail, where we saw the finest examples of education, where attendance was certainly compulsory. But given that there's been nothing, as I can see, happened dramatically from 2004, are you conscious that every year 4,000 young people are leaving school not able to read or write? Are you conscious that 80% of the people who end up in jail are children that didn't attend school and left, some of them not able to write their own names, but albeit discovered in jail that they were quite intelligent, bright people, some of them went on to write their own books and so on. I mean, is it good enough, Mr. Sweeney, to come here today 10 years on, from the last time I sat on a PEC account, and tell us that in 18 months you're going to change things, when Millburn has already done it? Ballysally, an estate that was wrongly portrayed in the media as the estate. Fantastic work. I mean, are you sleeping on your hands, or do you know about these schools in the most socially deprived areas that are getting it right?
Chair, just to respond to that, I mean, it was exactly this time last year that we took the evidence session on literacy and numeracy, and some of the points that Mr Dallas has raised there were at the very heart of that discussion. So am I aware of the kind of impact of non-attendance and poor educational outcomes? Answer yes. In terms of what we've done, I don't want to at this stage of the evidence session list a whole range of kind of initiatives that we've taken, but just to cite one major kind of, if you like, very significant policy shift within the department. When we published in 2009, Every School a Good School, at the very heart of that, it was about autonomy within schools. It created the environment whereby the department was saying to school leaders, such as Mr Platt in Millburn, that look, the department believes in school leadership, and we delegate authority to schools, and we give as much support as we possibly can, because the people who are best placed to tackle these issues, such as underachievement and poor attendance, in the first instance, are the school leaders. So the department's focus has been about getting behind that high-quality school leadership, pupil-centric, community-orientated, good Board of Governors, because when all that comes together, terrific things can happen. But sadly, it doesn't consistently happen.
You can tend to it.
Oh, go, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, the order of question is Trevor, Paul, Adrian and Dahi. So Trevor.
Thanks, Chair. I know it's been cited twice as an exemplary model. I don't know, and I'm not trying to cause friction between yourself, Chair, and myself. I would rather we had, as a committee, had an opportunity to discuss some of the things we heard last week, rather than citing everything was perfect, because whilst on the surface of it and the presentation was excellent, we haven't the time to drill into some of that, and I may have a different view on some of it, whilst the reports may say something different. So I'm not trying to take away from what you've said or John has said. Certainly the evidence in terms of Millburn, but I just don't know that it's entirely everything as it was portrayed to us last week. I have a wee bit sceptical on some of it, but I think as a committee we needed time to discuss that as a committee first before we come to the conclusion whether the committee supports everything or otherwise. That's the first point. But just come back, just whenever Mr Swinney said something about every school a good school, that was a great statement that was made, or a great catchphrase. But, and I mean, I'm slightly straying off the report, and I know you'll soon pull me into line, Chairperson, but that was a strap line. But there is schools that are good schools, and the department are destroying those also. So I'd like you to bear that in mind. I know we're talking about attendance today, but that's all that was. That was a strap line, headline grabber. But we have schools today in our own constituencies, in every constituency, that are good schools, but are not getting the support by the Education Service. And I think you can back that up even with the fact, even if we want to bring it back to what we're supposed to be talking about today, why are the schools not working with your service to identify there's a problem, and why is the education welfare support team not working with the schools, actually trying to identify what the problems are within the schools? You know, it strikes me that the two things are disjointed, and the sooner those are fixed, then we can identify the problems. Because one of the statistics in this one, which is interesting, is that the unauthorised absence has grown from 27% to 33%. So I don't know, Mr Swinney, that we can get 18 months. I think we're talking about a report that's come back to 2011 in terms of those statistics. Another 18 months, and the value of what that means to the education of our young people today, it's going to have a detrimental effect. And I think the point that John has made as well made, one thing this committee was united on was the visit to McGilligan Prison and the outcomes that was coming out of that prison. But it's sad that the statistics that John Dallett has said today, that you actually basically have to go to school to get a good education. I would like to think the majority of our children are going to our schools to get educated, not to come out the other end to go to prison to get educated.
Thank you, Mr Clerk. Paul?
Just in relation to, and it's to deal with the permanent secretary approach in this, and I appreciate that that's your position, Paul. If we're dealing with spend, and if any other government department were to be wasting 22 million, in fact, within the report it did state that it was a loss. They were receiving funding for pupils who were supposed to be in school, and because of a lack of follow-up, they're not in school. We have unauthorised absence rate of double, and it's exactly double what is in both primary and secondary level within England. So, and I don't think that they're all dealing with their areas of deprivation any worse than what we are in some instances. So I think as a department, either policy is being made and not always implemented. We're all great at producing plans and programmes to try and deal with it. What measure is being taken to ensure that we have consistency between one school, which is good practice, and a neighbouring school, which basically is not working? And probably, yes, you did allude to the fact about leaders in schools, and I prefer to call them principals, in schools which are probably there because it's a job as opposed to a profession. And I think that is one area that I really do. I think there's some people in education who should not be in education because it's a job for them, it's nothing else. They're not in it because they love to work with young people and teach them. I'm not putting everybody into that, because there are some wonderful examples of those who go the second mile, and because they understand children and young people, they can actually get them to go the second mile. What mechanisms are in place to ensure that those sorts of people are the people that are attracted into education, as opposed to those who just want to get a salary?
Shall I come back at this stage, or would you prefer to go round the members?
I might want to come back on this.
Yeah, because I have quite a few number of members looking to come in on this one. I have Adrian, and then Sean, and Dahi, and Michael. So Adrian.
Yeah, well, mine's a very simple question. It was asked by John and again by Trevor. You know, it's 10 years since the last PAC report. So now there's a matter of urgency. Now, after looking at this one, you're going to have it turned around in 18 months. You know, what did you do for the last 10 years? And why there's so much urgency now?
Okay, thank you. Sean.
Just very quickly, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
And really on the same point, there really seems to be a big disconnect between policy and reality. Because, you talk about, and Paul talked about school leadership. You said in 2009 you're getting behind the whole area of school leadership. But when you looked at the last year's ETI annual report, where was the major weakness? School leadership. And you don't just fix school leadership by a PQH or something else. It's a much more complex process than that. Why are we so far behind in terms of really developing school leadership? Because, as Paul says, every good teacher doesn't make a good leader.
Thank you, Sean. Dahi, Michael, and then Ross.
Thanks, Chairman. The report's obviously on pupil attendance, but you find that you end up discussing about a wider array of educational matters, and certainly we did in the adjournment debate here yesterday evening as well. But I was going to make the same point similar to what Sean said about leadership. Leadership's absolutely crucial, and I've been to so many schools where the principal has changed, and the new principal just brings a breath of fresh air through that school, and the whole school changes. So it shows that it can be done. But what focus is the department and the boards putting on leadership training, and ensuring principals are held to account as well in terms of delivery. But a lot of this as well obviously comes down to putting your resources where the need is, and I would say there is the clear correlation between those from low socio-economic backgrounds and the attendance figures. I always look at Ballymena Town in terms of the figures compared to those who were reared in certain wards and what particular school they go to in the town, and the same applies for school attendance as well. So it's quite clear what a lot of the problems are, and whereas schools can go to a certain point and what they can do, and obviously there is an onus on the community and there is an onus on the parents. A lot of the good case studies we see concern schools where the principals and the teachers are pulling the parents into the school, because a lot of parents still just leave their children off at the school gate and leave the job to the teachers. So we need that holistic approach, and I don't know what kind of strategy there is in place to ensure that parents are more involved with the school. How do we build relationships between parents and teachers, other than just going to the occasional PTA meeting?
Okay, thank you, Dahi. Michael, and then Ross.
Thanks, Chair. Just two small points, one of which may be anecdotal. I remember very many years ago asking the Chief Executive of the Belfast Education and Library Board, not the current one, the previous one, in my innocence, what his primary legal responsibility was, and I fully expected a reply that it was to ensure that school buildings were clean and properly built, that teachers taught properly and that children got an education. And then it turned out, when he told me his primary legal responsibility was to live within budget, that sort of set an alarm bell ringing. The issues that I have with some of this stuff are, we have children who are not attending school. Now that can be something that they're choosing not to do, or someone who is not giving them a reason for not going, or it can be that those who are legally charged with sending them to school and taking them to school aren't doing it. And those are three very separate questions. Are there any indications, graphs, correlations between the levels of non-attendance, which are most probably, according to this, in families on low income, and the teachers who teach in those schools? In other words, is there a malaise that affects not only the pupil, the student body, that's the right term, but affects also the teaching body, because the difficulties that many of these kids take into the school are difficulties that are rooted in the home, and the school has, in my view, an even more difficult task with those children. On the back of that, I have to say that in a certain school in East Belfast it was disused. I think it is 68 pupils when it closed. There's now a very enthusiastic gentleman who attracts nearly 150 kids 6 nights a week to learn
but they don't know they're learning. It's done through a slightly different process. So are we sure that in examining the causes rather than gathering the statistics, because gathering the statistics ain't no good, you've got to understand what the causes are and then address them. Are we sure that the non-attending pupil, and again unauthorised isn't a term I like. I think there's only two types of behaviour: it's acceptable and unacceptable, and unauthorised maybe gives it the wrong connotation. Are we sure that, for example, we're aware of the sickness levels among staff in schools, or the sickness level, which seems to be the biggest single contributor, among the pupils is highest?
Okay, thank you, Michael. Ross, and then I'll take yourself. Last one, Ross.
I have to say, Chair, that from the start of this, I've not been impressed with what I've heard so far. Certainly, as Adrian pointed out, 2004, it's quite a while ago, 10 years ago, and we seem to have gone no further from 2004. We talked about parents, teachers, governors and the board. Not once did we mention pupils. Not once did we mention perhaps talking to pupils. My father died when I was 13. When I was 13, I just couldn't be interested in going to school. I went, because if I didn't go, my mother would have skinned me alive. But I went, but I didn't learn, because I didn't participate. And looking back now, I can see exactly why I didn't participate. I wasn't interested. I was a 13-year-old boy. I'd lost my father. And nobody asked me. Nobody. So I left school with 3 O-levels to my name. You know, and I know why that was. But I didn't really start to work at school until I went to the technical college. In fact, I didn't start to really work at education until I was 44 and I did my degree. So I know what it's like. Pupil attendance is a major issue, and we have to look at how education is delivered. We have to look at various schools, certainly some of the buildings. I'll declare an interest as a governor of Omagh High School. Schools falling down around them. Yet I got one of the best reports from the Department of Education that any school has ever had. Why? Because the staff are good and the staff are prepared to teach, and the children are learning. Simple as that, they're learning. The other point that was made, is it a town issue, is it a rural issue? All that must be taken into account. And we also have in here in relation to perhaps to the travellers. It's a separate issue, but it's quite clear if they're travellers, that's what they're doing. The family are travelling, so therefore they're going to move on. Yet nobody seems to have taken on board, but hold on, why don't we find out where they're going and sort that out as well? So there's a lot of issues here, and a lot of issues I'm sure too when we look at rural versus urban. If spuds have to be picked, what's more important? Lifting the spuds or going to school? And that's going right back 30, 40, 50 years. That was always the way. But as I say, I'm very, very disappointed from all that we've heard. A, the figures were wrong at the start, so that's your homework marked wrong before you start. If we did that at school, you'd have been kept back. If we're told we have to wait 12 to 18 months, I agree totally with Trevor. 12 to 18 months is a nonsense. This has to be worked on now, today, and move forward. 12 to 18 months. We've already wasted 10 years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, members. Before I allow Mr Sweeney in, I just want to remind members that I suppose the focus here today, I know there'll be a difference of opinions around school policy and that, but the focus here today is solely on pupil attendance, and we don't want to kind of stray into any other area. So I'll allow you, Mr Sweeney, to come back to those responses.
Chairperson, maybe before Mr Sweeney comes back, I think the issue raised by Sean and then followed up by others, the whole leadership thing, it would be very valuable to hear in terms of leadership what will be in your strategy that will bring forward a different type of teacher in a leadership role, and what kind of testing will be in place to ensure that the person is not applying for a job but actually wants to enter a vocation and has the kind of commitment that we saw in Melbourne, but we know fine well it was in McGilligan Jail and it's in other schools as well. That kind of leadership that doesn't actually require somebody to sit all day tracking roll books, but in fact, as the children told us, they don't want to miss school. They just wouldn't want to miss it. Where is that? I mean, I know traditionally what happened in the past. Disruptive pupils, teachers were glad when they stayed at home because then they thought they got on with the ones who wanted to learn. But that's how we filled our jails, that's how we left people with no skills, unemployed. That's how we created the divided society we live in. So obviously the strategy you're going to tell us about now should encompass those concerns that have been expressed by other members as well as me.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, shall I respond now to some of the points?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
obviously, there's a whole range of issues there, and you know, if you just take school leadership alone, you could spend a whole session on that. So I'll try and cover as many of the areas as I possibly can.
Yeah.
And then I think rather than dominate, if you like, the evidence session, I mean, I think in terms of the role of the Educational Welfare Service, the role of the Educational Library Boards, and if members want to delve into some of the specific detail around some of our policy areas,
Yes,
Caroline,
absolutely.
happy to help there as
Yeah,
well.
and that'll happen after you respond. Yeah, thank you.
In terms of just responding, if you just bear with me here to get my notes in place. I mean, the idea of the Department of Education destroying schools is something that I wouldn't recognise or not sufficiently support in schools. But if there is evidence of that, please, you know, I'm more than happy to deal with that. In terms of the remarks about people approaching their professional task in education as just another job, I've worked in a number of departments over the decades that I've worked in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and I can say that the professionalism and the passion that I've experienced in the Department of Education towards education has been most impressive. And you know, I want to just put that on the record that it isn't just another job. I mean, it's
that might well be on many occasions, but there are those, and it just takes one or two bad apples to destroy a whole thing, and one bad leader can destroy a whole school. Exactly.
Well, I'm going to come on to leadership, but I thought I needed to make
Yeah,
the specific remark
clear.
about the remarks that were made about the Department of Education and the officials that work there, okay? And I know that that professionalism and passion is exhibited across the education and library boards as well. With relation to Every School a Good School, and when I do get the opportunity to outline what we have been doing over the last 10 years, because I think the members have wrongly got the impression that we've been sitting on our hands, and I want to be given the opportunity to debunk that idea, right? But it is important that it dwell, first of all, on the remark about Every School a Good School being a strapline. The reality is we spent nearly 2 years talking to all the key people in education before we formulated that strategy. We consulted on it, and we've been recognised subsequently as it being a really sound document. Now, from my point of view, it was initiated in 2009. And, you know, it's a time now to kind of look at it again. We should never sit on our hands and assume, as one of the members says, that things will self-implement. So there is an opportunity to revisit Every School a Good School. But it has been a game changer, I believe, in terms of giving the primacy to the leaders, to the principals in the school. The remarks about the unauthorised absence, yes, I mean, this is a very serious issue. The fact that on the face of it, it would appear that we have twice the rate of unauthorised absence, that would be the case in England. There are a number of perhaps reasons for that, and if the members want to delve into that, Caroline can go into that in some detail. Just moving on, before I outline what we've been doing over the last 10 years, if I could talk about school leadership, because I do think this is a common theme coming through. I mean, such is the importance that the Minister attaches to issues such as school leadership and school attainment. He tasked me recently to meet with the 30 area learning communities right across the region. So between the period of the end of September and early January, I've had the privilege of meeting with all the post-primary principals in clusters of 30 groups. And it is remarkable how much that common theme about leadership is coming through. And I have to say that all of them consistently were sort of saying that, you know, in their professional experience, it has never been more challenging to be a principal or a school leader today. And some of the kind of evidence that's emerging here, particularly in the post-primary sector, is that the number of applicants now going for posts, particularly in the post-primary sector, are worryingly low in terms of the pool of applicants going forward. What we heard from the profession, when I specifically said to them, what more do we in the department need to be doing to support leadership? I mean, this is what I heard. Newly qualified principals in particular feeling wholly unsupported on their own. So they need more mentoring support. And they need mentoring from people who are currently in post or have just recently retired. There was mixed views about PQH, I have to say, and one of the members mentioned that. And there was mixed views about the master's programme. But I believe that the most insightful experience that I got was the leaders were saying to us, look, empower us to develop leadership within our own profession. And what we were getting was some excellent examples of schools. And there's an issue of scale here. If a school is large enough, it can become a kind of a learning community itself, and it can generate leadership. So there was tremendous insight as a result of that experience, and the department's given serious thought now to what additional steps we need to take. Because there's no doubt about it, if there's one thing that can bring about change, that can bring about a real turnaround in a school, it's about ensuring that we've got the right level of leadership. Look, in terms of the steps that we've been taking over the last 10 years and the impression that we've done nothing, I want to just flag up a number of areas, but I don't want to give the impression that we're just ticking boxes here. But it goes something like this. Yes, first of all, there was the issue around data. And certainly from 2007-08 onwards, the department has been producing annually a census of all the schools, detailing on a school-by-school basis, on a constituency basis, so every member can drop down to their constituency, draw out any school, and you can have the rate of overall absence. And that's published by the department. It's professionally pulled together by NISRA. The other elements of tackling absence were as follows. We issued a number of circulars over the last number of years, which helped to kind of perfect our data collection. So I believe we're in a very strong place now in terms of the data collection. We did commission a major piece of research, McClure Waters. They looked at tackling attendance, particularly in schools under stress. And as a result of that, we were able to then bring out guidance in June of last year that set out good practice and required schools to develop a strategy for tackling attendance. Coming back to 2010, every school is required to produce a school development plan. And they produce those annually, and their plans rolling forward for 3 years, and they're submitted in the first instance to Education Levy Boards. We require from 2010 onwards for the schools to factor into their school development plan, again, a strategy for tackling attendance. Just moving on. The curriculum itself has been a very important focus around all of this because sadly, particularly as you see when pupils come to kind of towards the end of their career, the curriculum perhaps for some pupils in the past was not perceived to be as relevant as it might be. But certainly from 2007 onwards, we have revised the curriculum. We've brought in a great deal more focus around vocational training, and we've brought in a much more pronounced role for further education. So there's, if you like, more reasons to stay at school. So just to recap, Chair, we have taken a number of steps. We've focused on a number of very specific groups, and again, we can go into detail on this. Newcomers, looked after children, school-age mothers, and so we've been focused on a number of particular areas, and some good results have been achieved there. For example, the attendance of travellers have went up by 6% in primary school and 5% in post-primary. Looked after children, we've had a 2% increase there. And I believe that we're collaborating with all the key agencies, all the key organisations and departments. So if you like, we have all the component parts of approaching this in a strategic manner. What we now need to do is give it more impetus. We need to be more explicit about attendance, and we need to marshal this into a strategy that hopefully will identify additional steps that we now need to take to make sure that we start, getting those figures hopefully down.
Just on that point, Mr. Sweeney, would you agree with me that there is disjoint between the department and the ELBs around all of that?
around managing attendance
and the whole data system around it. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think Claire's keen to...
Well, there are different data systems that are obviously utilised. Mr Sweeney has referred to the Northern Ireland statistics that are produced in relation to school attendance across the province. That is made available not only to schools, but obviously the Education and Library Boards give consideration to that. There's also the school-based data that is collected on an individual school basis in relation to attendance, and that is collected through a module that's part of the C2K framework. Separately from that, there's also the information management systems within the Education and Library Boards that relate specifically to the referrals that are made to the Education Welfare Service. So there are different data sets that are available to assist with the collection of different types of information in relation to aspects of overall school attendance, and then more specifically those parts of the school population for which more difficulties have been identified. Thank you.
Chairperson, could I?
Deputy Chairperson, Adrian and Trevor had indicated, and then I'll let you. Is that okay?
Thanks, Chair. Just, Mr Sweeney, what you've told us there, what you've done in the last 10 years, well, really, what you've only done is from 07, was there farthest you go back. So really, you sat for 3 years whenever the report was produced before you did anything. But however, you haven't mentioned anything to do with. You haven't done any work around parents who maybe had a bad experience at school and don't see that as an important part of their life, and that's passed on to the next generation and maybe the next generation. Could you tell us if you've done any work on around that side of things?
Okay. I mean, the report that came out, I think it was November 2004. In 2005, we took the earliest opportunity in terms of our regulations for school development plans, again, to be explicit about attendance. In terms of involving parents, one of the most important initiatives we then took was in 2006, where we set up the Extended Schools Programme. Now, the Extended Schools Programme is targeted towards those schools in the most disadvantaged areas. There's about 500 schools now receiving about £12.5 million. Now, importantly, again, central to that is the whole issue around involving parents, involving the community. And nearly 40% of those schools, for example, have breakfast clubs. And what we've seen is, if you get that holistic approach, as somebody mentioned earlier on, involving the community, involving parents, involving them in things like breakfast clubs or homework clubs afterwards. I think when you went to Melbourne, you've seen examples of, I think if it's not once a term, at least once a year, Mr Platt there involves the grandparents and the parents in a bespoke breakfast club. So the Extended Schools Programme, introduced in 2006 and has developed since, has been an important reaching out into the community, reaching out into the parents. And more recently, in terms of developing that programme, we've asked schools to come together in clusters where they have good practice around tackling disadvantage, tackling attendance, and particularly involving parents. So, no, we didn't sit in our hands. I mean, we've taken a whole range of opportunities to intervene. And I say this, if I can use the term this afternoon, our strapline has been more about achievement. But of course, inextricably linked to achievement is attendance, because even the best teacher in the world, right, can't achieve for a pupil if there is irregular or persistent for attendance. So, if we've given the impression that we haven't been doing enough, I think the fault has been relentless focus on achievement, right? Yes. But we need to be more explicit about targeting attendance and the criticality of attendance. We need to be more to the fore there and be more pronounced in terms of just stressing the criticality of that.
Absolutely. If you don't get attendance, you don't get achievement.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Could I just add to the work in terms of parents and engaging with parents, as you said, the negative cycle. In addition to the extended schools, there's also the Sure Start programme, which obviously focuses on the preschool children, and that is very much around engaging with the children, their families, both in terms of their lifestyle, health, education, and a lot of that is around breaking the negative cycle there and encouraging good behaviours and positive lifestyles early on. So that's very complementary to then the later extended schools. The other thing is the more recent Education Works campaign. The Minister kicked that off, I believe, in 2011, and that was also in a recognition of we need to speak to parents emphasise the value of education and parents getting involved in children's education. Now that had, in the first 2 tranches, focused on younger children. As we move forward, we're going to focus on older children towards GCSE age, because that obviously then is also a trend where the attendance tends to fall off after year 8, 9.
Yeah, just Chairman, can I come back on that just quickly?
Briefly.
Just the Sure Start programme, yes, certainly is working, and we saw an example of that in our own constituency in Harpers Hill. John and myself one Friday there. But there was a problem with the funding of that as well. You know, they were never sure what funding they were having from one year to the next. So, you know, I think if Sure Start's going to work, there needs to be more of a foundation put in there, so they know from year to year they're going to have that funding and it's available, when it's available, and all the rest of it. So, just want to mention that there, but it is, I think, it is actually working in the community.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you have a number of members who want to come in there with supplementaries. If I could ask them to keep them brief. Trevor, John, and then Paul.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Swinney, the sooner we get down to the questions and get you off your script, the better, because you have said, in terms of the 2004 report, we're now in 2014. You're citing all these wonderful examples, and it's lost in the detail on what you're trying to say, because it does sound as if you're working from a script. If what you've done since 2007 is so good, why is it still failing? Because you didn't still answer my question in terms of the unauthorised absences since 2007 to 2011 have increased by 5%. So when are you going to realise whatever you implemented in 2007 didn't work? And when are you going to implement something that does work, and don't wait every 10 years to come back to it?
Can I just say, before, when you left the room, we did touch on unauthorised absences.
All right, so I apologise for that.
When you're on your own.
Sure.
Yes.
I didn't actually get the first sentence there of your question, sorry.
Which bit, the bit where you're on your script, or when we've got you off your script?
Well, the script was about middle through. It was didn't get the first sentence, but look, I'll attempt to answer your points, but I didn't hear the first.
Well, the point I'm making is, if whatever you've done, and I mean, you're trying to put yourself on a pedestal in terms of your script today about what you've done since 2007, but given you've accepted the report, even though you shouldn't have accepted it because it was wrong, which was your own failure, but in 2007 to 2011, the unauthorised absences have increased by 27% to 33%, which is obviously failing. So what you have implemented in 2007 doesn't work. So when are you going to recognise whatever you have tried to do didn't work? When are you going to revisit it much sooner to make something work? And hopefully not leave it for 10 years before we go back to it.
Well, I don't think the report's wrong, Chair. First of all, there was one particular set of data in the report that I corrected today, and I think that's my job professionally to do that. I mean,
you should have done it, obviously, but whenever you first seen the report.
Well, ideally, yes,
Yeah.
but I mean, I drew it to the members' attention when I became aware of it. In terms of failing, I don't think it's helpful to get into that sort of discussion around what is very, very complex. And the report itself, there is no magic bullet here. There's no magic bullet here. The young people that we're talking about here, and you know, when you focus on authorised absence, we're talking about young people who have, in very many cases, multiple behavioural, social, cultural difficulties. So the department will do its level best in conjunction with boards and schools and parents and communities to tackle that, right? But I don't want to give the impression this afternoon that there is some kind of magic bullet, that there's one single step that I can take now that's going to dramatically change that figure. But I do believe the focus, and this comes through in the report, because the report is predicated on the work that Mr. Taylor has been doing, and he has been sort of indicating that the focus should be more on overall attendance. Now, I'm not taking comfort from this, I'm just making an empirical statement here, that although we're well out of kilter in terms of unauthorised absence when you compare Northern Ireland with England, the reality is when you look at the overall performance, we're not dramatically out of, in terms of overall absence, we're not dramatically out of kilter there. But look, we need to do more. I'm acknowledging that. I'm completely open-minded to what additional steps we need to take. But I'd be kind of false if I give the impression this afternoon that there is a magic bullet, that there's just one policy instrument and you just pull it and magically all those complex issues disappear. They don't. This is about relentless attention to kind of leadership in schools, involving the community, looking at data, relentlessly kind of setting realistic targets and holding people such as myself and people in the boards to account.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney, Deputy Chairperson.
Chairperson, thanks for the opportunity to come back again. Sometimes it's not helpful to be about too long, but you know, homework clubs and breakfast clubs, they're not rocket science. They've been about for years. Parental connections with the schools. Some of the best examples of that I saw in Malawi, in Central Africa, where the parents, if they were still alive, were there to support the schools. So, but let's get back maybe to the question of this computer system, C2K. It's a wonderful invention, but it's not. Information's not available to the welfare service. What's the point to have a computer that doesn't talk to anybody?
Well, I'll shortly ask Claire to deal with C2K, but just again to say to the
I'm
member.
more interested, I'm really not interested in the computer because we discovered it at Melbourne. It's not the computers bringing the pupils into the school.
It's nothing to do with
But what are you doing with the information that's on these computers to alert the welfare service that there may be problems at the home, there may be issues that need to be sorted out? It's not happening according to this report.
Maybe perhaps I could assist with this particular question. In terms of the C2K system, the C2K system is a school-based system for recording pupil absence. There's a module on that system that is related to recording pupil absence. That system was introduced around the mid-2000s and has been used by schools to provide more accurate recording of absence, both in terms of AM, PM and other breakdowns associated with it. Currently, the system is set up, as I say, ostensibly as a school-based system. Education welfare officers access that system when they go into the school, because the data on that system is owned by the school. The school is the data owner, and so therefore the school needs to give permission for the EWOs to use that data. The EWOs routinely access that data through various SIMS inquiries, investigations that take place. I think one of the issues that has been raised in the report, and I think perhaps you're referencing, Member, is that it might be helpful to establish means by which the education welfare officers could access this information without necessarily going into the school. And that's something that a pilot was done a few years ago, taking a very small sample of schools to identify some of the technical issues that did require redress in order for EWOs to access the system from their offices. That coincided with the transformation of the C2K system within schools as a whole, which commenced around 2012. And further to recent engagement with C2K, their professional opinion is that we would need to recommence a pilot across the 5 boards in relation to EWO access from offices to ensure that the arrangements that need to facilitate optimum utilisation of it can be provided to all EWOs. So the intention really is that that pilot would commence in September 2014 with the aim of identifying what other technical issues may impact on EWOs accessing that information from their offices.
Chairperson, the road is paved with good intentions. You know, and we've heard Paul talking about a strategy. I hate to ask the question, but I assume this is not in the strategy.
Well, in terms of that whole issue about data collection, right, and if you like, optimising the use of technology, right, will be, well, first of all, has been a part of our strategic response to date, but will undoubtedly be part of, you know, a strategic way forward. And what Claire has outlined there is, you know, we're hopeful as we move forward that we can make better use of the technology that's available to us through that platform that is C2K.
But from what I hear, I mean, we're not even sure that you can share this information. It's certainly not available off-site. It belongs to the school. And we know from our own research that schools have different approaches to this. Some take it serious Others are not taking it serious at all. Where does the warning lights come on in this computer to say that some poor child is in danger of going through the net?
I'm going to ask Alex, who's the...
Would it be helpful if I explained how an EWO works in the
Anything would be
system?
helpful to solve this
Can I
problem.
just say, Alex, before you start, that the EWOs don't look good coming out of this report. The Education Welfare Service, it's not very good reading in this report.
If I could
So,
maybe explain how the system works. Each school has a contact education welfare officer, and each school has a service level agreement with each education and library board, and the service level agreement is set up for individual schools. In other words, if schools have a lot of attendance issues, they will get a lot more input from EWOs than, for example, Millburn, where they have few attendance issues and they operate on a need-to basis with the school. We work on a referral system. In other words, the school is expected to do the initial intervention with the pupil's attendance because the pupil is enrolled in that school. And when that intervention doesn't succeed or fails, we then expect the school, if the attendance comes down to 85%, to refer it to us. The EWO will then take up the case and work it. And when attendance improves again, the case will be closed. In order to make sure schools are not omitting referring any pupils, we would do a termly audit in the school, and that would involve the EWO going through the C2K system and identifying any pupil that's attendance is below 85% and talking to the contact person in the school about the attendance. At that point, if the EWO is satisfied with the reason given by the school, i.e. if the pupil has had a lot of flu or has a broken leg or something like that, we will say that's fine, we're happy enough with that. However, if the school has no satisfactory reason for the pupil's attendance being below 85%, we will suggest that the school makes a referral to the education welfare system. Service.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett. I'm just very conscious that members may be straying into people's area of questioning as well. So I have a number of members who have indicated that they want to make a comment, but if it's their area of question, are you happy enough to hold it, or does anybody want to come in at this point in time? Michael?
I'm not sure that what I'm going to say has actually been covered in this at all. Within the area that I represent, which is East Belfast, we have some of the best schools, some of the worst schools, for the poorest, for the wealthiest wards, side by side, and 3,553 children living in poverty. Poverty is a moot word. Are we sure that we are not concentrating on establishing the number of children who don't go to school and losing the real important thing, which is why they don't go to school and what can be done to persuade or require them to go to school? Children, in many cases, are a potential source of income because of the nature of the benefit system, for example. There's barely a day in the week that I don't see some new syndrome or case or symptoms that indicate that a child may be entitled to disability living allowance, for example. And you wonder sometimes if the conditions... Now, I'm not saying there's no need, because there is a financial need, but I believe that in some cases children, by their behaviour and non-attendance, are actually acting out a subplot in a much different piece of drama. I've seen children at school gates, first and second year, drinking Boost and energy drinks, and the reason for that is that they'll go berserk for about 3 or 4 hours in school and then present with a scenario of cases. I'm just talking straight, because there's no point in coming here and beating around the bush. Do you feel that the current system of data adequately addresses what the symptoms are, what the cause is, and whether or not they're real, and recognises that the child that doesn't go to school in many cases is the victim? And are we satisfied with the way we go about assessing? You can collect data to your blue in the face, but unless you put it to some good, useful purpose, it doesn't count for diddly squat, and that's just being quite frank. Are we sure that we are then doing everything possible to identify who is actually responsible for the child not attending school, and making sure by hook or by crook that that changes? because this has become, I think it's probably the second, borderline third generation. If I hadn't gone to school, we had a thing called the beat man, and he'd have got the policeman, and then your parents would have been in trouble. My recollection, it didn't happen on the same scale, and now it's almost as if going to school is a self-selective choice.
Before I allow you back in again, I think there might have been one or two members wanted to also make a comment on that very point. Dahi, did you want to, is it on Michael's point you wanted in?
Separate point.
Separate point, okay.
Red Bull.
You get that?
Yeah, but Paul, did you want to come in on that point?
Well, I was really to go back on what we had been dealing with previously, and it was to do with the accountability issue and the fact that a figure had been, and how accurate that figure is something which needs to be maybe delved into. The loss of money that has been allocated to schools on their attendance or the number of pupils that are to attend, and to find that there is a previous report, the 2004 report, figure worked out costing 12 million roughly, to an increase of 22 million per year lost due to children non-attendance. And we hear about programmes that are being mentioned as a way of dealing with issues, and the expanded Pull Schools programme and all of that, and 12.5 million being allocated to that. What measures are put in place to see that those benchmarking additional monies are actually bringing back value? Because it doesn't appear to be adding to it, because there's a clear correlation between link between attendance and educational performance. Very clear within this report that schools where children are attending and they have better results by far than schools where there is no focus or appears to be no focus upon ensuring that attendance is a key factor. And I think that that is something that I want to see. How can we see a uniformed approach? You can have a school a mile from another school where you have a 10% difference upon their attendance records in 1 year. And there's a mile difference. Both of them are coming from the catchment of similar social backgrounds, yet you can see that difference. When can we see that consistency coming right across the board? Because if it's supposed to be dealt with on that basis, it's definitely not presenting in that way. And I still bring that back to the leaders within those schools as not having, or some other aspect. Because I've seen teachers, and I know you're very quick to try and defend some of them. I've seen teachers who I believe should never have been teachers. Should never have been teachers, because they turn children off, they humiliate them, they want to make them feel that size as opposed to feeling important. And how do you deal with that?
Chair, I want to apologise to the member first of all. I didn't come back on the 22 million, so could I take an opportunity now just to mention that? Yes, I mean, the report in the annex does set out the methodology by which the 22 million is
might be more
ascertained. Well, if you just use the unauthorised absence and you extrapolate from that, then £3,000 per pupil in the primary and £4,000 per pupil in the post-primary, these are approximate, and you approximate that up, it's 22 million. Now, is that a waste of money? Is it a shameful waste of money by the department? Should the accounting officer be concerned about this? You know, the sad thing is, the opportunity cost is at the pupil. It's the pupil, and as an extension of the pupil, it's the parents selecting or condoning the child not going to school. That's who's kind of losing out there. Because as far as the education is concerned, there's sunk costs anyway within education. So the opportunity cost is at the pupil level. Getting back to Mr. Copeland's point, he's left.
But before moving off that, if a school has an attendance record of below, say, 84 or 85%, they conversely, if they believed they were going to have their budget hit by a margin which was below what the average should have been, they would take measures to address the attendance within that school. If they felt it was going to hit their budget, therefore they were going to have to let teachers go or do something else, I think there would be more of a focus made on it.
Well, I'll come back to that, but just on Mr. Copeland's point, let me just state the obvious. There is, sadly, a very direct correlation between levels of absence and, if you like, then, schools that are in stressful situations. So, as you know, in extremis, if the inspectorate assesses a school and a school finds itself that it needs special intervention, it goes into formal intervention. So, if you take that benchmark of 85% or below, sadly, there's a very consistent, and this is the point about the relevancy of data, there's a very clear correlation between high levels of absence and high levels of kind of, if you like, educational underachievement, and a direct correlation between a number of schools who are in formal intervention who would have high levels of absence, and certainly the profile of schools that Mr. Copeland spoke of. There would be a number of schools. So, for example, if I was targeting now tonight, there's 37 post-primary schools and 5 primary schools who have attendance records of below 90%. So, let's start there to begin with. In terms of the remarks about teachers, I don't think I'm in a position this afternoon to comment upon that. Obviously the profession itself does its level best to have a performance regime in place and to identify where, if teachers are underperforming, that they're given the right support. In terms of the point you make about a school being in close proximity to another, yes, part of that's about leadership, of that there's no doubt. But likewise, you need to look at the profile of the school. One school might have very low level of special educational needs or very low level of free school meals entitlement, which is a proxy for kind of disadvantage, whereas the characteristics of another school might be dramatically different. So you have to see every school in its own context. And as the report itself says, we need to be flexible and pragmatic about how we respond. But Claire, did you want to make a point about the data again?
I think my point really is that whilst we can talk about attendance in general, I think it's important to bear in mind that children are at school for what is ostensibly 12 years of compulsory education, and the strategies that need to be applied throughout those 12 years to address attendance need to be different. One of the core issues is that if you look at primary data, the attendance actually of children in year 1 and year 2 tends to be a lot lower than children in years 3, 4, 5 and 6. And you've got to ask the question, why? And one of the key things that we've got to bear in mind is that children need parents to bring them to school. And if parents have issues about arriving at school late or not arriving at school at all, it immediately impacts on the attendance of very young children. And in doing so, very young children then acquire habits, behaviours associated with going to school or not going to school that are enforced and reinforced at an early age. So I think what I'm really trying to emphasise is that as we get into the detail of what we need to do across the 12 years of compulsory education, I think that the data provides us with evidence that whilst we might be thinking overall there's less of an issue in primary, my analysis of the data is actually there are issues in primary that require address, but they are perhaps masked by the fact that the overall attendance in primary is deemed to be better than post-primary, but yet I believe that it will require very specific approaches and interventions. Likewise, at post-primary level, across schools, the schools that I'm in on a regular basis emphasise the fact that attendance is important, but it's also about the engagement and participation of the young person in education, and the more adjustments that schools make, not just in terms of the curriculum, but in terms of the sense of creating the school as a community, the culture and ethos of the school as a welcoming one for the young person, and other forms of support for young people who have difficulties, you are more likely to get pupils to attend. So I think what I'm really saying is that if we're going to focus on how we can improve things, we need to be what I describe as developmentally sensitive to the approaches that are required as we move our way through the school system.
Okay, thank you. Members, and I know Ross is looking in and Dahi's looking in and Sean and Paul had indicated earlier, but I am conscious of time and we have our lines of questioning in front of us and some members may have strayed into that. So if it's okay and members are content, Ross, is there something that's pressing?
I want to ask specifically in Educational Welfare Service. I want to point to clarity because the way this is worded, schools can make a referral to EWS. It doesn't appear to be compulsory. The EWS seems to be able to go on and look for this or whatever, but no, there's no direct link, which I find very, very strange in these days of computers, that we can't have a link, or that a teacher can't, whenever they see a certain trend, email somebody and warn them or whatever. And when you do see this 15%, and I'm sure it's been mentioned before, that it could be up to 28 days a year missing from school, that there's something not right. So I want clarification. Schools can make a referral. Can they or must they? I mean, if they don't, there's something not right. And at what point does the 85% become 85%? Because in the first term, you could have, 8 weeks? And then that could be, 12 days absence. So at what point is this a referral? And you also made a comment that somebody could have continual flus. Well, if a child had continual flus, I would be worried about their health as well. You know, if it's 15%, there's something not right. If a child is continually ill, there's something not right. If they had a broken leg, they'd make some form of compensation in the school to get them in, should they have to carry them in. But this optional, I find very strange.
Can I just add that there as well,
Yeah,
Chairman?
very
I think the 15% cut off 85%, you know, is triggered in, I think that's far too high. You know, it should be triggered in a lot sooner than that there.
Yeah.
Can I have your thoughts on that, Alex?
Well, the figure was agreed some years ago as a figure that would be manageable, and it's in common with the figures that are used in England at the moment.
It's also useful to add that the actual arrangements are that the school should refer where there's a concern or the 85%. So certainly there is.
Surely the school's well aware of the trend before it gets to that target. You know, they see it maybe every Tuesday, every Wednesday, every child not being there. Whatever the reason for it, it's what they're doing on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, or what the parents are doing on a Tuesday or a Wednesday.
And if England is outperforming us, if England's using this system and it's working for them, but it's not working for us, should increase it to maybe 90% to get the buy-in quicker, the intervention quicker.
The other interesting, I mean, Chair, if it's possible, the interesting thing about England, and we mentioned it earlier, is obviously they have a very different culture in that they have a very much sanctions-based culture with fixed penalty fines being able to be issued by the school or local authority without recourse to the courts, and then if they're not paid, they're doubled, and then eventually you move to prosecutions. So there's a number of other things going on in the background with England over and above the use of educational welfare.
Well, that's in the news at the minute, with children being taken out to go on holidays because it's cheaper.
Absolutely, and they also, I mean, up until recently, and this affects some of the authorised, unauthorised figures. Up until recently, principals in England had the ability to authorise school holidays up to 10 days a year. For special circumstances, and certainly Charlie Taylor, the government's advisor, found that principals tended to do that to avoid confrontation with parents. So it was almost a given that they got 10 days authorisation. That changed in September just past. Hence, that's why you see a lot of publicity and parents being taken to court, because that ability has been taken away from principals. Now, the position in Northern Ireland is as it is now in England, in that principals can only authorise school holidays in exceptional circumstances. Otherwise, they're unauthorised absences. So it'll be interesting to see if the England figures for next year change in any way. But regardless of that, I mean, their overall absence figures, are, ahead of ours to some degree.
Is there any consideration being given to increasing that to 90% rather than 85%?
Not actively at the moment, but obviously, the deliberations of this group is going to be important.
Just can I go back just to the Education Welfare Service? As I said earlier, it doesn't make good reading within the report around that, and there seems to be a degree of complacency. Would you agree with that, Mr Sweeney, given the fact that the department fund the Education Welfare Service to the tune of 1.7 million? Do you believe that they are delivering an effective service?
Well, Chair, I approach these committees not in a way that seeks to be defensive, but I wouldn't recognise complacency, as a term that I would use in terms of the inspector. I mean, the 1.7 million is a kind of a top-up that we give to the service. In total, approximately, overall, there's about £8.8 million going into the Education Welfare Service. It was evaluated by the inspector in 2002, and there was a follow-up report in 2006. And the inspectorate report was very positive about the contribution that the EWS was making in terms of responding and managing attendance, right from preventative work right through to sanctions. So, no, Chair, I wouldn't describe it as being complacent.
Do you believe that ETA has delivered or produced any reports in this area? Would that be in terms of guidance around this? Have they produced anything at all?
ETA?
Yeah.
Well, they evaluated the effectiveness of the Education Welfare Service in 2002, and then they did a follow-up report in 2006. So I appreciate that was some time back, but that was the last time that the Education Welfare Service was evaluated.
But there needs to be obviously a more strategic approach to it with ETA.
Well, certainly, I mean, I'd have to say, as a result of this report, and look, let me say, there's always scope within the department, within the boards, within any element of education, there's always scope for improvement. You start with that premise, right? You don't sort of say this is perfect, right? But the report has, as a result of us engaging in the department and with the boards, has challenged us to give more impetus to this work. And it might be helpful, Claire, if you outline the commitment now that the 5 chief executives of the education and library boards are embarking upon, specifically in response to the shortcomings identified in this report. Would you be happy enough, Chair, if we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the rationale for saying is I'm just conscious that in England, the Education Training Inspectorate has produced in England and Wales thematic reports in this area, so I think it would be key. Chris wants to come in on this.
England. Just, Paul, thanks for the answer so far. It's really on the ETI, just to get a better grasp of the subject. To what extent do ETI look at absenteeism as they inspect schools going along? Do they look at targets and outcomes? In which detail do they offer advice?
Well, yes. When ETI would do a report, they would focus on a number of areas. Now, absenteeism would be within that sort of heading of pastoral care. To what extent is the school, over and above the pedagogy, the education, to what extent is the school looking after the emotional well-being of the child? So in that regard, if a school was on, triggering on thresholds, ETI would draw attention to that in their report. But importantly as well, the role of the district inspector here. So the district inspector is on the ground, and he or she has a dedicated range of schools that they work with. So there's proactivity there. So, like for example, and I take Mr. Hussey's point about is the threshold set at the right level. But a district inspector could say to a school, I'm just being hypothetical here. Look, I've noticed that you've dropped down from a credible performance of 93 5 years ago, 93%. You're hitting 90%. You're in danger of going below 90%. What's happening? So there's a challenge, albeit relatively informal. There's a challenge function that takes place right from the district inspector. And then, of course, when you get the full inspection report, there's a range of indicators, and if there's a plummeting of performance and attendance, the inspector can draw attention to that, largely because the reasons we know it can be directly related to a whole range of other issues.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going to come on later on to the sharing of good practice and stuff. I think the role of the DAs are crucial here to improving. Is it not happening then? In these areas where the figures are quite high, are the DAs not doing what they should be doing? To help, because it's innovative. I totally accept there's no magic bullet here completely, and there's only so much a department and schools can actually do. But is there something the DAs should be doing more of?
Well, certainly, the DA, there's a number of opportunities. I mean, on the ground, it might be sort of saying, look, why don't you kind of pair with a school that, had a similar sort of profile a number of years ago and has turned it around? A large part of the report is suggesting, and rightly so, that we need to create greater networks where schools, particularly schools that are underperforming, can come together and kind of share the experience. Now, you bring in schools that are exemplars as well. So, in the first instance, the district inspector could draw attention to this. I would like to think that he or she then would sort of say, look, can I suggest the following? Or, in addition to that, the schools should be involved in a very serious discussion with the Educational Welfare Service. So there needs to be greater focus on prevention, greater focus on early intervention. And I'm saying, look, we need to be doing more of that. I accept that entirely.
And just before moving on finally on that, do you think we should embed it more in the inspection process, the issues around absenteeism?
Well, a good example of the relevancy of this group, right, is when we met last year and we did the literacy and numeracy, one of your core recommendations was that we should look at good practice and disseminate it. So what we did, the department then, subsequent to the PAC last year, was we tasked the inspectorate to draw best practice. Now, in this case, the focus was around mathematics and English. So the inspectorate went to schools that were exemplars in English and Maths. We brought out a publication, and now we've disseminated that. So nearly 500 teachers have been now proactively engaged with the inspectorate on that good practice guidance. So the logic of this session would be, we need to be doing something similar. We need to be kind of looking at good practice. We need to be kind of commending it and acknowledging it, and then disseminating it. You know.
Thanks.
Thank you. Briefly, Sean, and then Dahi.
It's a very small one, and Paul, forgive me, but this highlights the disconnect between the department and ETI again, because we've heard this morning in our ETI inquiry in education, the DI only has a total of 10 days per year to do all its district inspection functions, in addition to general inspection and all of it. So we met, as part of our inquiry, we met the DIs, and they are drawn in 10 different directions. They actually haven't time to do all this. What's the big problem?
Okay, thank you. Dahi, and then we're going to go into the meeting.
I'll keep it as short as I can, Chair. No, I just want to focus on the area of health for a moment as well. Obviously, there's a number of cases in school where pupils have to be off for weeks at a time or months at a time, and it can be very hard to catch up on the work again, and it could lead to the whole educational year being ruined. I'm just wondering what approach or what strategy schools have to deal with that, because we're living in the age of Skype now, where everybody's keeping up to speed with each other through the internet, and I'm wondering, is there options there where pupils can still engage with classes or listen in on classes, but not being able to attend the school? Also, as well, I think breakfast clubs are excellent. That relationship between how healthy you are, having a breakfast, and performance in terms of education, your attention span and everything. Are we doing enough in terms of breakfast clubs? Is there an opportunity to extend that out further? Because I know a number of cases, it's not always down to your socio-economic background as well, where a child gets up in the morning, falls out of bed, falls into the car, falls out of the car and into the school without getting a breakfast or anything. And I know of a number of cases like that. But, you know, is the department doing enough, or boards doing enough in terms of breakfast clubs, and also in terms of safer routes to school as well? I know Sustrans has put a focus in that area, because having a degree of exercise in the morning certainly increases alertness and attention. And, you know, in terms of environmental impacts, and the environment in terms of impacts on health, it also affects education. So we shouldn't just focus on strictly educational matters. It's much wider than that.
Member, would you mind if I just, in a sense, consider perhaps some of the areas? If I take the area of children who are absent from school for a considerable period of time, it's important to differentiate between the impact of a longer term absence and children who have short and frequent absences. It is generally thought that children who have a long term absence, whilst that may appear to be more difficult and challenging to deal with, it's a discrete period of time. You know the last day that they were in the school, you know the first day that they hope to return to school. In situations like that, if children are going to be off school for a period of time, the medical reports, the medical recommendations, they can access tuition, which provides links between the school and home when the young person is at home and is well enough to access education. In some instances, work is being done through Illuminate in relation to other forms of support. That's predicated, of course, on the appropriate consents taking place. But I think that the bigger worry for us really would relate to pupils who have short and frequent absences, because those are the young people who dip in and dip out of school. They are less likely to get into what I would call a school routine. They are less familiar with schoolwork. They get part of a topic, but not all of the topic. So in reality, they're the group that I consider to be most vulnerable and, in terms of their absences, most likely to have a negative impact on educational outcomes. You raise the issue around healthy schools and things that schools can do over and above in terms of breakfast clubs. In some schools, that would be reflected in canteen options, if the school has a canteen. It's also reflected on healthy eating breaks and other things that are done within the school to promote the health and well-being of the young person. In the wider health and well-being agenda, we have a number of schools that see themselves as now being defined as mentally healthy schools, because there is a recognition that the attendance of teachers, as well as the attendance of pupils, is important in bringing stability and continuity to not only the quality of the teaching experience, but also the levels of engagement and attachment that children have with teachers. So, in a sense, there's training that has been provided in some of the boards in relation to promoting mentally healthy schools. And there's other work that's generally done around promoting health and well-being as part of the wider school curriculum, and that has been done both in primary and post-primary level through counselling services and other forms of school-based support. So I think as we move forward, we see the totality of need of the young person and recognise that various strands of specific and specialised supports need to be put in place to affect the best outcomes in terms of the particular needs of individuals.
In terms of that, is there going to be an increased resource towards those areas, given there's an increase in recognition of the benefits of those breakfast clubs and so on? So is there going to be an increased resource? And also in terms of the effect of those, how has the department measured the impact in terms of educational performance?
I can't comment on the resource, and indeed some of the things that happen in schools can be resource neutral. It doesn't always have to bring or cause additionality of funding. We do know that there are some schools that have also banned fizzy drinks and have taken other actions because they wanted to create a context where concentration enhanced focus on learning. So whilst we don't have strong data, we would have qualitative data which would indicate that the measures that have been put in place are affecting some change in terms of pupil engagement at school-based level.
I would say this, Chair, to the free school meals is approximately £40 million, and on the free school meals, 80,000 pupils entitled to that at the moment, and that will increase by a factor of another 15,000 pupils. So that's important. In terms of evaluating the effectiveness, yes, things like the Extended Schools programme have been evaluated by the inspectorate and has had a very, very positive evaluation. And other programmes recently that we've put in place, the Minister has announced a community-based fund, like it's £2 million a year, again specifically targeted at the most disadvantaged areas, and again to involve the community and parents in the life of the school. And we're very flexible about how that money can be spent, in the sense that there's a fair bit of degree of flexibility there about how the school can work in conjunction with the community and parents. So it may not necessarily be an extension of the breakfast club, but there's a range of other interesting ideas coming through. So where it's possible, additional resources are being targeted towards those schools in the most challenging circumstances.
It's just a term used there was entitled to free school meals. Would it not be better to use the term uptake of free school meals, because there are a number of people who are entitled to them who don't necessarily apply for them? And I know one school in particular where I reckon there are quite a few kids who could be getting free school meals, but because of either a bit of pride within their family, there is a reluctance for them to even engage in that, and some areas that is greater than others. So I don't like using that term entitled. I would say the uptake of free school meals, because there could be many that are entitled to it who don't get it or don't take it.
And every, sorry, Claire.
I was going to say that there is an issue around entitlement and uptake, and I do know that the data that we have pertaining to that would indicate that more schools where there had been an issue around the gap between entitlement and uptake are having more constructive, positive conversations with parents in relation to it, not only from the point of view of the benefit to the young person, but also from the point of view that it also has an impact on the funding for the school. So the evidence that we have is, whilst there's still room for improvement, we can see some significant changes in uptake in areas and in particular schools that historically wouldn't have elected to avail of it.
Just on that point, I mean, obviously there's an issue about stigma and stigmatisation around free school meals as well. And I know some schools have a card system, so you don't see free school meal entitlement. How has that been rolled out, or where are schools in regard to those kind of systems to deal with that?
It depends on the school. Some schools now would even have electronic systems that wouldn't even involve a card at all. So I think the transparency around what's happening, it's becoming more covert, but it really does depend on the school.
But there's still a lot of schools still just give you out the meal tickets,
different coloured tickets.
It might, obviously it'll still happen, but what I'm saying is that as particularly post-primary level, it happens less. So as other systems come in place, they're deemed reliable and more people sensitive.
And do we have any idea what the scale of that is across the...
I couldn't today, but if it's helpful, I could get you some information. It'll be forwarded at a subsequent time.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Before I bring members in now to do their formal line of question, but I am conscious, without scaring you, that a lot of members have already asked their questions, so this end of the session will maybe brief, so in case you're wondering if we're going to keep you here the rest of the day. But I just want to go, I mean, because we are talking about early intervention as well in terms of levels of absenteeism, and there's one of the Programme for Government Commitment programmes, the Incredible Years one. And that's a very good an initiative, and that's a parent and mentoring one that's developed, you know, community-based, and it involves the parents within the school and a programme of, you know, working with the community, working with the school, understanding, you know, children's absence from school, what that's all about, and how they can go forward in that. So there are a number of good programmes out there at the minute. I am very conscious of it within the department are running through the Programme for Government, but and maybe somebody may want to touch on that later on in their areas. Members, we have a number of, and as I said, a lot of members have already asked their questions, so this session might be brief. So we have the Deputy Chairperson in terms of progress and development strategies to improve attendance. Alex and Adrian, if you are going to be touching on the role of the Education Welfare Officer, Alex, are you?
Well, I'll just go ahead anyway.
You'll go ahead anyway. And Sean, Management of Information Systems.
Just a wee bit left.
A wee bit left. The Learning from Good Practice. Dahi, you obviously touched on it as well, and Chris. So I'll start. So hopefully everything's been covered. But and Michael, socio-economic issues, if you want to come back. And
I haven't started yet.
So, I'll start with the Deputy Chairperson.
Chairperson, that's probably timely, and I do take your advice. I'll be brief. Obviously, my section of questioning is moving forward. Now, I didn't detect, this is not a criticism, I didn't detect the kind of passion that's required to solve a very serious problem. And I think all of the members of the Public Accounts Committee did really get caught up in this one, because we're very conscious we're talking about individuals. We're talking about individuals who will go on to have families and who might pass on those terrible weaknesses in education to the next generation. And we referred earlier to those who unfortunately end up in prison, largely because they had no self-esteem. They were patronised by druggies, paramilitaries and all kinds of people who give them a kind of importance at the education system. However, I would say that I think the hearing has been very useful. Paul, the strategy you'll come up with, it suggests to me, and other members I think have highlighted it, Chairperson, you know, the inspectors, the district inspectors, the education welfare officers, the leaders in the schools all need to be a team. And you can't do this. I mean, my memory of a welfare officer going in, he was almost an inconvenience. He went into a corner of an office somewhere with a briefcase and he spotted out individuals and that. He or she done their bit. But this requires a lot more than that, Paul. It requires a lot more than a computer sitting in a school that nobody can get access to outside the school. It requires early alerts. It requires people going out into the homes where there's serious disadvantage. Perhaps it's alcoholism, perhaps it's all sorts of illnesses. I mean, is this strategy going to be different from what was promised in 2004? I mean, is this very excellent publication here going to be taken up seriously? And are we going to detect from the department the kind of passion that we experienced in those schools that actually have bucked the system and have turned it around in the most disadvantaged areas? And it's a plea more than a question. Is it going to happen?
I know, in terms of, do you want to specifically talk about education welfare officer being an inconvenience in the corners?
I think you're correct. That may have been the picture maybe 20 years ago. It's certainly not the picture nowadays in schools with education welfare officers. Education welfare officers in schools would regularly meet with teachers to discuss attendance issues. So they wouldn't be seen as an inconvenience in the corner. They'd be seen as a key part.
Sorry, Alex, just, you know, I mean, your answer's been helpful, and I'm not disputing it, but can a welfare officer feel passionate about this? Can he or she go banging the principal's office saying, "Hi"?
Yes, they can make a nuisance of themselves.
But you're writing the press statements about your achievements. Yep. Little Johnny down there hasn't been at school for 8 weeks. Yep. Can they do that?
Yes, EWOs are very passionate about their job. They wouldn't be doing it if they weren't.
Good.
Because they're not paid as much as a lot of other people who have the similar qualifications in different areas. So if you're an education welfare officer, you're passionate about your job. That's part of your story, basically. Not only do they meet with the school staff regularly, they also go out and meet parents regularly. They'd be working with parents, especially Claire mentioned earlier, children in primary school. The issue quite often with them is not the child not getting into school, it's the parent not getting the child into school. They'd be working with the parents, helping parents to set up boundaries for their children, doing some very basic stuff that you expect parents to be able to do, but sometimes these parents are parents with a lot of challenges in their lives and they can't cope. We would be dealing with parents who suffer from alcohol abuse, from substance abuse, who are suffering from domestic violence, a whole range of issues. And a lot of these parents simply sometimes just can't cope with getting their children into school on a regular basis. But the EWO sometimes is the only person going into that family who's doing that type of work. They're trying to get the parent motivated to get the child in the morning, help the parent to set targets for their child, even if it's only a little simple sheet of paper, and putting little stars on it in the days they're in school. So the EWO was really motivated and really working alongside those parents.
Can I stop you there, Alex? Recently I paid a visit to Sure Start in Coleraine. Extremely impressed. But they told me, Chairperson, the areas that Sure Start can be of help don't just magically fit into the awards.
Yeah.
Is there, who can influence Sure Start, who can bring about a situation where Sure Start can help parents in trouble? Say in Coleraine, it would perhaps up the Mount Sandal Road, which is perceived to be middle class, but we know there's problem there who need help.
That's part of the difficulty. If they don't fit into the particular region, they won't get the
What's happening about that?
Especially nowadays, whenever there's so much private rent and people are moving out towards there to get a house, maybe to suit the family. I think, you need to be changing what's the situation and the time.
Flexibility.
Is that something that
is
addressed? You're obviously aware of it, Alex.
I'm aware of it, but I'm not quite sure how to tackle it, to be honest.
But is that not something that we need to do? Because we know, Adrian, myself and others know, the children are not in the right wards to get the support and the help
Yeah.
that they need.
Yeah, there sometimes is ways of getting support for the parent that's above and beyond the EWO.
Percentage.
You can sometimes refer them to family support hubs if they're willing to go that way. A lot of the parents wouldn't be keen to go down the route of social services, but they see the family support hub as a more friendly method of getting some support.
Well, could I suggest that you go away and think seriously about this, because there is a serious problem. I think Adrian's quite right. Because of the private renting now, it has been a complete nonsense of dividing areas up.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the fact that a lot of these, it's targeted within neighbourhood renewal areas, and a lot of these families are outside the neighbourhood renewal areas.
And Caroline was going to maybe just...
Chair, just quickly, if they are going to go away and look at it, can we get some form of response to what's going to be done? Because it's not Korean, it's Oma. We all have the same problem.
Caroline?
We'll concentrate in Korean.
Yeah, I understand there is due to be a review of Sure Start. I'm not entirely sure exactly what stage that's at, but we can certainly clarify that to the committee. It's obviously been going on for some years now, and it is due to be reviewed in the near future. But we can provide details.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I also just wanted to, Mr Dallett mentioned the need for passion going forward, so just to try and convey a bit of passion on behalf of the department. We're very clear, it was mentioned earlier, I think Mr Garvin mentioned it, it's the leaders in the schools that are doing really well. They're the passionate principals. You can see that's reflected in their attendance figures.
You would encourage that, Caroline?
I would definitely encourage that, and what we're
You
going...
wouldn't bog them down in bureaucracy?
Well, this is the interesting thing. We're not, we do need, as Paul mentioned, the strategy moving forward, but the department's not about to sit in its office in Rathgale, as pleasant as that is, and draft a strategy for a year. What we're also doing at the same time, and in speaking to principals, is actually, Paul mentioned it earlier, to establish a number of networks seminars, the first being in the summer term. And the idea there, and this is very much speaking to principals on nurture issues recently, they appreciate getting in a room together and exchanging best practice, talking to each other, learning from each other. So that's exactly how we're going to move forward, and we'll be choosing the schools carefully, whether it's dividing into primary, post-primary, and schools who are doing it well and not so well. But obviously we want, it's not just the end there, and we will be taking the views from those principals to see, well, look, do you want further guidance? You don't want to create guidance that's simply set on the shelf. If it's something useful, can we do something related to ESAG's TV, or is it an ongoing engagement with principals directly between, it'll be involve ETI, EWS and schools, because as you mentioned there, everybody has a role to play. So I can assure you, this is something we are grasping, and actually directly with principals.
Thank you, Caroline. And again, I'll go back to the neighbourhood renewal area thing, and I think it's something that should be done in terms of the departments working in collaboration. I think we need to expand on the neighbourhood renewal status, because a lot of these families are largely outside those areas, and we are catching a brave number of families within the neighbourhood renewal areas, but there are those families that the hard to reach, the transgenerational issues that keep reoccurring in families, they're outside, they're moving outside the neighbourhood renewal areas, and those are the families that we have to target. So I appreciate that information coming back. John, you're content with your questions? Yes?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I do apologise, I have to leave.
Yeah, okay. Alex or Adrian, do you have anything to add? Or
I have just one thing to add
just
on
one,
from that. Can we see some joint up between the Sure Start and neighbourhood renewal and the EWOs and all that? I think it's working too much a distance between each other. Can we have some way that we can join it all up? Is Sure Start a DSD-led?
No, Sure Start's a DE-led project, but there is input from, obviously in Sure Start there's health input, there's a number of agencies who would input. Likewise, in terms of neighbourhood renewal, although that's a DSD lead, it is all joined up. The Delivering Social Change programme that the Executive launched recently, if anything, the good thing coming out of that is the greater joined up work between departments, ourselves and DSD on nurture, and then DEL are working on family support hubs, which very much link into the work of the EWS and EWOs on the ground, are linking into that sort of work. So that is definitely the way to move forward, a greater cross-departmental
Can I mention a couple of ongoing programmes already? One is the transition programme that's funded by DSD through Neighbourhood Renewal in the Dungannon Coal Island area, which is supporting young people in P7 through to Year 8. So it's helping their transition and then picking up and supporting any that look as if they have problems with the transition. There's also mentoring support tutors funded by Neighbourhood Renewal by DSD through Neighbourhood Renewal in Omagh, Dungannon, and Armagh, and one coming online in Craigavon. So there is quite a bit of EWS Neighbourhood Renewal going on.
No, that's some confidence. Well, I heard that just sort of over my head there. So.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Alex?
Yeah, hi. You probably answered my questions, but I'm going to ask you them anyway. The Audit Office report raised an issue with the lack of mechanisms in place to support young people who have been disengaged from school. What mechanisms, in your opinion, might be put in place to provide the support that these young people need? That's good. I didn't ask you that. That's good.
Maybe if I just start off in terms of some of the aspects of it. I think, again, when we start looking at issues around engagement or lack of engagement, sometimes it can happen at the individual pupil level. And sometimes that can arise where there are familial issues that impact on the young person's willingness to attend school. In other words, stresses at home actually are such that the young person wants to be at home and doesn't wish to be in school. There are other issues that can sometimes arise post-primary where peers as a cohort decide not to go to school. And that can happen within particular communities where a group of young people collectively decide that they don't wish to go to school. I'm using that as two very clear examples in terms of, again, different strategies needing to be applied to those particular cases. In certain parts of the province, we have, for example, identified particular projects that are for young people who are more vulnerable, who, for example, have been involved in drug misuse or alcohol abuse, but at the same time where we wanted to facilitate engagement with school. There are programmes that are also around making the connect between education and health and social services in relation to some of the case management arrangements and other family conferencing arrangements that should apply. And also there's work that's done between education and child and adolescent mental health services in relation to young people who have significant mental health needs but who need support. And in that regard, for example, in the Belfast area, we have the TOPS programme, which is for young people who have been identified through child and adolescent mental health services as having underpinning mental health issues which impacts on attendance, but for which other forms of educational support in a context other than in school is being provided, so they access at least part of the curriculum to support their needs. So I think what we're trying to do is to put a range of measures in place dependent on the assessed need of the individual or the group of young people to which we're concerned.
Would you accept that you maybe will not use specifically because you weren't about, but since 2004 you've been a wee bit, it's been a bit slow to put these mechanisms in place?
My view would be that we have put a lot of mechanisms in place. We perhaps have not been as overt as we could have been in terms of what those mechanisms actually are. Okay. So I think that there's an issue around being more explicit about the work that's done and making the connection between some of the work that has been done, particularly in relation to vulnerable groups and attendance, and recognising that whilst the core issue in the headlights may not have been attendance, but the participation engagement was about attendance with a view to assisting with, pupil achievement.
Okay, could I quickly just ask, out of the 16,000 cases of persistent absence, they're not necessarily 16,000 pupils. There could be multiple pupils having 15% off. Isn't that right? So do we actually know how many pupils that would be specifically for?
My understanding of it is 16,000 pupils.
That met the threshold?
That didn't mean that would be under 85%, yeah. Okay. But it doesn't distinguish those pupils which maybe are not fit to attend school for whatever reason.
Okay. How can you assure this committee that out of those 16,000 that they've all been followed up? more needed to be referred or not referred? How can we be sure?
Well, as I said, the Education Welfare Service do a termly audit in each school across Northern Ireland, and that identifies any pupils that's under 85%. And then a conversation takes place with the school to identify if the school is aware of the reason for the absence or if the absence requires follow-up.
So there's been 16,000 conversations?
Yes, yes.
Right, that's a lot of conversations.
It is a lot of conversation.
I should also add the department just last year tightened up on its guidance about school absence and very much emphasised the need for schools to put in place early intervention strategies. That guidance is applied from just September of this current school year. So that was based on experience of a working group of EWOs and school principals. And so we've been a lot more explicit in terms of what we expect of schools and what we need to do.
Okay, following on from the Audit Office 2004 report, there is little evidence of a joined-up approach in the delivery of the education welfare system across the boards. Constantly there is a debate around the need for a joined-up approach to service provision, and EWS is no different to that. Given that this was raised in the first report and again in this one, what will you be doing to address this joined-up approach? And why hasn't it been done since 2000?
Well, maybe can I start off in terms of what was done post 2004 in the first instance. In 2004, some of the issues that were raised related to the professional qualifications of the Education Welfare Service across the 5 boards. We now have a Northern Ireland Social Care Council professional development framework that relates to the qualifications and supervision of EWs, which hadn't been in place prior to that date. Alex may wish to elaborate further on elements of this, but I just wanted to get you to have some sense of the fact that a lot of the issues that were dealt with post-2004 were about the professional competencies of EWs, the professional registration framework, the recognition that there were specific pieces of targeted work within the Education Welfare Service for groups such as looked after children, school-age mothers, for which dedicated staff within the service worked to meet those needs. And there was also then further work that was done in relation to bringing more alignment to what the chief EWOs and education welfare officers did at local level. And maybe I'm going to ask Alex to give more specific detail about the monthly meetings and other frameworks that have been put in place across the province.
The chief education welfare officers would meet once a month, and we would look at policy, strategy within the service and the need to deal with any particular issue that comes up. The education welfare has a common referral form that would come in from schools, so no matter what part of Northern Ireland you live in, the same referral form would be used for children. We also use the same assessment form to assess the needs of the young people that are referred to us, and this is called the Unicini, the Understanding the Needs of Children in Northern Ireland. It's a form also used by other agencies like Social Services and Health. We would then develop a plan of work for the young person, and this would be supervised by the Senior Education Welfare Officer. Built-in supervision is an important part of the work, and it is required by the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. And once the work is ongoing, and the work can involve the EWO working with a young person face-to-face, one-to-one, or it can involve working with a group of young people, or it can involve work with the young person's parents if the young person, is a very young child. So it can be a wide range of work that's ongoing. It can also involve, say if the young person is involved in drugs or alcohol abuse or particularly risky behaviour, it can involve the EWO getting other agencies into this and getting the young person the appropriate advice and assistance from a specialist agency. So a lot of work can be ongoing there. The EWS also has common systems of recording casework so that everything is recorded to an acceptable standard that meets the requirements of the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. And we also have a common method for closing cases and recording the closure once the case has met acceptable patterns or levels of attendance. So basically that is the levels of common practice across Northern Ireland now that all EWOs and all education and library board services provide in relation to education.
Okay. I just realised you've got the same name as me. Right, anyway, taking that aside, in terms of taking some of the parents to court, sort of like a last resort, that seems to go on forever and a day, and it's very complicated, and quite a stressful route, and it doesn't really seem to achieve much because of the amount of time.
Yeah.
Is there other mechanisms you're looking at that might do away with that to try and get that sorted out better?
Well, we have to work within the legislative framework such as it is at this point in time, and that means whenever we get to the point with a family or with a young person that we feel doing supportive work is not going anywhere, and we have to take some sort of action, otherwise the board is failing in its duty to ensure that the young person has an education. We have two options really. One is going down the route of an education supervision order, and that's under the legislation provided by the Children Order, and the other is prosecuting parents under the Education and Libraries Order. And we would consider which would appear to be the most appropriate. If it's a young person who's out of control, or where the parent is maybe deemed to be at fault, it's likely to go down the route of a parental prosecution. If it's something where you think you can work with the parents, i.e. it's a very young child or a primary school parent, you probably will go down the route of an education supervision order. We haven't been particularly good at using education supervision orders in the past, but we are moving now more towards using education supervision orders, especially with younger children. I agree with you, you're correct. Prosecuting parents under the magistrate's order hasn't been particularly successful, and this is probably demonstrated by the fact that there's a lot of repeat prosecutions go on. You know, the parent is prosecuted once, and then the following year is prosecuted again, and the young person's still not attending. Yeah. And, you know, that is a problem. Something else that's also an issue is we would have young people who would probably fall into the category of child in need for the fact that their parents are not ensuring they're educated. However, we can't get a referral to social services except in those amounts.
Would we be able to get the costs of these court cases that you've
Yes, I can provide
over the
that
last
for you.
several years, just?
Yeah, okay.
Well, the magistrate's court is relatively cheap to prosecute through. The children order would cost a couple of £100 per prosecution, so it can add up.
Yeah, just be interesting. To be glad to hear my last question. Irrespective of when or if ESA is established, what are your thoughts on the Audit Office recommendations that the Department gives consideration to a more joined-up approach and consistent approach in the provision of an EWS under the current 5-board structure?
Well, if I may assist initially in relation to that, I met with my Chief Executive colleagues recently further to the consideration of the content of this report, and I want to say at the outset that the 5 Chief Executives are fully committed to supporting the implementation of the recommendations associated with this report. We recognise the need to bring enhanced consistency to the delivery of attendance issues, not just through the Education Welfare Service, but through other mechanisms we would have available to us, and indeed through other services. And I think it's important to stipulate that at the outset. Whilst the Education Welfare Service is mentioned today, other services can also have a role in terms of supporting and promoting attendance. I think the view across the 5 boards really is that at board level we can give enhanced prominence to attendance through the wider school improvement agenda, and also through the quarterly reports either at Education Committee in each board or through other equivalent structures within each board that facilitates the ensurance that attention is given to this issue. From an EWS perspective, the view of the Chief Executives was that we should have a common regional action plan with individual ELB targets to reflect local and specific need. And we felt that that was the most appropriate way of ensuring that we were working to a regional framework, but at the same time recognising the individual and specific needs of individual ELBs as we move forward. There was a recognition of the enhanced focus of attendance within school development plans, and the realisation that there's also interdisciplinary work between CAS officers, between the Education Welfare Service and indeed other board services who record attendance. For example, referrals to the Educational Psychology Service will record attendance on the referral form from the point of view of ascertaining has this child got needs that are related to their, that are intrinsic to their difficulties, or is an attendance part of that difficulty. Just a few other aspects that we think that we can bring forward to bring further alignment. More work will be done in terms of the procurement of the Education Welfare Services EMS systems. Those EMS systems have been in place for 10 years, and we will have the opportunity in the next 18 months through re-procurement to put forward more specific business requirements in relation to the type of data sets and the type of data reports that we would want that system to generate on our behalf. It's also recognised in the report, and again something that we are committed to, and that is to bring increased coherence to Board of Governors training in relation to the significance of attendance. And given that we will be reconstituting Boards of Governors with effect from September 2014, we deem that this is an opportune time to do so. And finally, it was referenced earlier in terms of some of the interface work between the C2K system in school and the Education Welfare Service access, and that's something that is being progressed with immediate effect from the point of view of doing what we can to minimise any difficulties that have been identified to date.
Okay, thank you. Can I just add to that before we move off from the Education Welfare Office? Is there, and now I'm going back a couple of years ago, I remember in my own area, is there a pathway where young juveniles, younger, teenagers, obviously where there is just, no coherence at all in terms of, getting them back into school, and court has been an option and it didn't work either. Is there a pathway where a young person, male or female, can go to, that it's not school, that it's some other establishment that they could be in to do other types of activities, around, it mightn't be academic, but it might be other, other approaches. Is that happening?
Not particularly at the moment. There would be, schools would try, if the young person is beginning to drop out of school, they would try to be flexible and create some sort of curriculum around the young person that would enable them to engage. And also there would be youth and EWO work currently ongoing. In some of the boards, we're trying to identify young people who are disaffected with education and provide support through from year 8 onwards, with particular support at year 11 and 12. So those sort of things are being looked at the moment, and we have identified a number of schools that Youth Service and EWS will be working in jointly to do this type of work.
We also have across the boards education otherwise than at school provisions for young people who have generally been very disaffected with school, and the first port of call there is usually around participation and engagement, and then gradually settling into issues around achievement. We've also had other pieces of work that has been developed on a project basis in terms of therapeutic models of support, and that has been piloted in the Western Board some years ago with interventions between, again, child and adolescent mental health services and educators, from the point of view of trying to encourage families to recognise the need to engage with key agencies if not only pupil improvement but other family-based issues can be addressed.
And just finally on that, just within the report, the Chief Welfare Officers told the Audit Office that schools are discouraged from referring cases, yet the Chief Executives of the ELBs says this is not the practice. So this was obviously a concern when we read this within the report. So I'm asking, what is the truth?
Well, the truth is that EWs would not discourage schools in general from referring to the Education Welfare Service. I think we need to unpick it a little bit in that sometimes if a school makes a referral to the EWS where they've done absolutely no intervention themselves, the EWO would say, can you carry out some basic intervention to see if you can resolve the situation here? Because the pupil is enrolled in the school, and the prime responsibility for that pupil is initially with the school, and it's only right that the school should carry out the initial intervention, and even to the extent of informing parents that they think there's an issue here before giving it off to the Education Welfare Service. Other instances where it may happen, but would be very unusual, would be if a school would make a large number of referrals, say on the 30th of June. There's absolutely no point the EWO picking up a load of cases on the 30th of June when they know the child is going to be absent for 2 months, because there's no point the EWO going out engaging with the family and saying, can you make sure you get your child in regularly? The EWO would probably in that circumstances say, can you re-refer these in September? So those are the type of things where the EWO may discourage referrals, because basically we are a very small resource, and if the school doesn't make the initial intervention, we do feel it's appropriate for them to do that before they refer it on to us.
As I say, that was a particular concern we had in the committee, and obviously if the Chief Education Welfare Office has told the Audit Office that, I mean, you've clarified that, but in my opinion, the Audit Office has been misled with that information. Moving on, Sean.
Just, Alex, one more. I can't believe it. Do you get referrals late in June?
Yes. I mean, it's an absolute nonsense. We would get referrals on the 30th of June. Some years, it seems as if schools suddenly realise the children who haven't been attending, and they sort of come to us on the 30th of June and say they've missed 20 days or they've missed 30 days. And we go, well, what do you want us to do? Basically at the end of the school term. Now, we would make sure we pick them up in September if they're still causing difficulties.
But related to that too, does it only kick into your radar when it's 85% attendance, when it drops that figure?
We would usually have picked those cases up earlier in the year at the half-termly audits. And they may well at that point not have been below the 85%, they may have been up at 90 or something like that. But the school sort of gets into panic mode coming up to the end of the year.
It's really, really a very low level, because you're taking 15 days absent the first 100. My counting, even if they were there for the next 90 days, the best they could make would be 91 or 92%. It's also establishing really, really bad practice as well. It's near enough close to a day a week off.
Well, if the school has particular concerns about a young person, we will take it earlier. Yeah. But, if there's reasons for the absence, it can be sometimes very ambiguous. And, I mean, for example, in a case where, the school was saying, well, look, I'm concerned this young child has been absent a lot, but has had a lot down to sort of illnesses, and they're just not satisfied with the parental response to that. We don't just let it go and say, oh, it's an illness. What we can do is take it to the community paediatrician and ask the community paediatrician to investigate. And also sometimes you will get young people who suffer from asthma or something like that. We can advise the parent, or the community paediatrician about this and see if they can look at the asthma management programme for them. So there's a number of things that can be done if it's claimed to be repeat illness.
Okay. I just want to look at the management information system. As you said, Claire, we've C2K since 2000, so it's established attendance modules there for 14 years. This report here in 2004 talked about more effective use of data as fundamental to combat and poor attendance. I suppose my first question really is, what review of that attendance module has been done to see how it can, working along with the Educational Welfare Service, can actually address this non-attendance issue? Has there been any review done, even asking schools of how useful it is?
I think C2K are in regular contact with schools in relation to the use of the system as a whole. I know that the data reports that we're getting in relation to C2K has also enabled us to be much more specific about the nature of the absences and also the profile across year groups. And I think that that's something that should inform us as we move forward. In reality, the totality of attendance is on average around 95%. If you consider the difference between the 2004 situation, there's been a marginal improvement in 10 years. But I think what we really need to do is to factor in what percentage of absences are real illness, which are probably around 3%, and what's the variance, which is that additional 2% or so that we really need to focus on to deal with children who perhaps are not ill, don't go to school. So I think what I'm really saying is that I think that the data sets that we now have enable us to have a much more specific focus on the subset of absences that we need to give more focus to.
I would just add that, just as Claire was saying there, from the time when the reporting became mandatory, the department has regularly reviewed how it operates and has reissued its guidance on exactly the categorisation and the codes that have to be used to allow a better analysis. So we have fine-tuned the system as we've gone along.
Thank you. Next one. Many of our schools, you have a survey when a child's off from school, it triggers a text message. How widespread is that?
It's becoming more and more widespread, and schools are using text messaging in relation to not just absence from school, but more specifically, absence from periods of the school day. In other words, by the time the young person has got home, the parent has already got the text message that you weren't there for double biology this afternoon. So some schools are using text messaging to very good and, may I say, intelligent effect. And increasingly, more schools are using text messaging generally, whether it's for attendance or for other points of contact with parents.
Is that good practice been disseminated to others?
It is, and in fact we are encouraging that because we see it as a very effective way. Sometimes the message isn't seen as being draconian. It's not a sanction. It is about sharing current up-to-date information between school and parent in relation to the attendance or non-attendance of your child, not necessarily even for all of the school day, part of it.
You did mention earlier about remote access to for the EWOs. Surely do we need pilots for that? Do we have virtual learning communities? You know, children and teachers can access their C2K stuff from home. Surely is that not just? Can we not just roll that straight out?
Can't. I mean, I have explored that option. It can be done, it will be done, but there are technical issues around it because not only of ownership but also about access. So what I'm really saying is that it's something that is achievable, but it requires a little bit more work, particularly as we now have a transformed C2K system that is different from the network that was in place 10 years.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Michael, and then Chris.
Sorry, just a couple of small points that are perhaps not receiving. We've already established that there is a linkage between socio-economic group income and non-attendance at school. The cut-off of this, I think, was 2011, 2012, which leaves us 2013, during which the income of the 10% of the most poor families in the province declined by £1,000. Is it likely that that will reflect in your figures? And perhaps more importantly, given the fact that the most seriously affected demographic should welfare reform be implemented in its current form, will be low-paid working families with children who would presumably attend school. Have you given any consideration? I wrote to every government minister asking them for their assessment of the impact should welfare reform be implemented in its current form. It's widely accepted that will see between 450 and 750 million taken out of the Northern Ireland economy through a reduction or a realignment in benefits. If what we're saying is that children attending school is affected by income, and we have already got a 1 year period where the 10% who are worst off have saw £1,000, and we're going to see another 750 million. To me, it seems that that cannot but have an effect, and has views done only predictive as opposed to historical statistics gathering to assess just the nature of the problem we could be facing. And do we have any figures as to the cost of that could maybe be offset by not doing bits of welfare reform?
Well, I think the short answer to that, Chair, is I don't have that sort of analysis, right? And we're straying on the complexities of the social policy implications of welfare reform. But can I say this from the Department of Education point of view? I hope that we've been able to demonstrate this afternoon that, within the resources that we have available to us, we're ensuring that they're properly targeted, particularly to the areas of greatest need. But earlier on we were talking about strap lines. I mean, poverty should never be used as an excuse. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do in education. It's about value in education.
But no, I fully understand. But is it an excuse, or is it just an accident that a very large number of those children who come from socially deprived and financially deprived backgrounds happen not to go to school, when it's that particular demographic that absolutely needs to go to school?
But I think what I'm trying to say is I absolutely, completely understand the dynamic of that, right? But we are seeing communities in really challenging circumstances getting terrific results, And, I take my hat off to that. And I believe the dynamic that's at play here is a community that values education, And that's where we need to I believe, put more effort and foster that kind of culture. As Caroline spoke about earlier, the Minister has put significant resources into that kind of, if you like, public campaign about valuing education, about grandparents and parents engaging with their people. So, look, as we look to the horizons, there's no doubt about it, the socio-economic conditions within which we're all operating are challenging, and with austerity are likely to continue to be challenging. But be assured of this, the Department will do its level best, right, to target resources where we can. You know, we're not acquiescing in poverty being an inevitable kind of, you know, educational poor achievement being an inevitable outcome of poverty. Because we know
historically, that would be what the statistics indicate, though, doesn't it?
The greatest empowerment tool out of poverty is investing in education, and that's crucial. And that needs a partnership between this Assembly, the Department, the boards, communities, parents. And I think, given the challenges that we're confronting, of all the social policy interventions that we could focus upon, investing in education, value in education, you know, can really, in terms of wasted resources, can yield, I believe, very, very good policy outcomes.
And just one last point. We have 5 separate types of education, broadly speaking, available in control and teen and faith-based and the rest of them. Have you responsibility for all of them? Use of responsibility for all of them?
Yes.
Every single one? Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Well, there wasn't a catch in that question, was there? Yes.
What I'm basically asking is, I suppose there are different ethoses within different types of school. Is there any that gives a better outcome in terms of actually getting kids to understand that going to school doesn't restrict their freedom, it actually gives you freedom?
No, I think this is where we started today. It's about the leadership in the local community, valuing education, you know, and really getting that joined up approach, right from nurturing, Sure Start, right to the primary, post-primary. And you've seen the range of interventions that are possible. So,
as I say, I've really quite personal reasons for asking, because my daughter works with NEETs, which are the consequence that flies from this. And as we were sitting here this afternoon, I showed Chris. Yet another woman tried to take his own life last night, 17 years of age. That's 9 since the beginning of December. Not just there, and that's the real price. And although in many cases that stops one type of expenditure, the ongoing costs are absolutely colossal. And in my experience, having employed, and most of the guys here would know the people that I employ, who manage to get through school without reading and writing, they're not stupid and they don't deserve to be written off. They're a resource that we do not dig our minds deep enough to discover, and that's my own opinion, Chair. Sorry.
Thank you, Michael. Chris?
Thanks, sir, and thanks, guys, for that today. As we've been around the house and back again, but just maybe a couple of points. I'll try and keep it as much closely to the sharing of good practice module that I've certainly looked at anyway, but I definitely empathise with the struggle to tackle this effectively, in that, you know, when we consider that, I think the figure is about 9% of learning is actually in the classroom between the ages of 4 and 16. It's very hard for a Department of Education, who deals with basically autonomous schools as well, to be able to implement something top down that in fact is a magic bullet. So I certainly empathise with that. But where I think, you know, we are starting to make headway, and I see that the Minister today was launching the Play Together, Learn Together initiative in Gallia and Derry. They're the sort of things we may not maybe see the results of for a generation, but it's where we need to start. And I think it's where it's important we embed that social policy within the wider education framework. With that in mind, is the Department working alongside maybe the Department of Health, the Department of Justice, maybe DSD, in generating a wider societal approach to absenteeism? I think that's, because I certainly think it's necessary. I think there's only so much that the Department of Education can do, and certainly that a school can do. I think the legal obligation, of course, rests with the parents. It's not even with the schools. Is there something we need to look at there, to say maybe there's something more we could be looking at to give strength to schools or to the department to be able to tackle this issue? I suppose I should maybe say from the outset too, Chair, I want to thank my colleagues across the way for probably making a better case today for ESA than I or the Minister ever has made before, so but I'll just put that on record anyway. But look, we'll maybe start with a few points before we move on.
Yeah, I can just make a few comments just from a departmental engagement perspective. Certainly the DSD, a lot of their neighbourhood renewal stuff does link into educational attainment already, and certainly our officials engage with DSD whenever we're assessing projects and evaluating projects on the ground to make sure that the educational outcomes are robust. But there's always more we can do, definitely. In terms of the Department for Justice, I mean, I've had an early conversation with officials there. They're embarking, I believe it's on sort of a youth sort of justice element, you know, preventing youth getting into criminal behaviour, and they're very keen to speak to us, and certainly they can see that the linkage is there where we need to look at, because obviously their stats show, as Mr. Copeland was saying, a lot of the kids getting into crime, they've got low educational, experiences, aren't going to school, getting into trouble. So we're already sort of building the links there on a cross-departmental basis. There's also the nurture work that's gone on through delivering social change, where we're working closely with DSD, and that is the early intervention work, where there's, for children in P1 and P2 who have these emotional, social, behavioural difficulties, they're taken out of their mainstream classes for maybe up to 2 terms and put into a really good nurturing environment. Now that also approach is being rolled through the whole school that has a nurture room. I mean, we got stats recently from a school, I'll not name them, but they are one of the new 20 nurture units, and even since November the attendance levels for children in those units have gone up things like 5%, 6% over a short period of time. So it shows what can be done when there's joined up working. So as we said before, the cross-departmental element, we are developing that and engaging with officials.
And see on that, sort of alluding there to the measuring of these initiatives, is it possible yet to really see if these initiatives, maybe it's the value in education one that was launched in 2011, or the play together, learn together, is there a cohort now we can start to see that these are working?
I mean, I can probably speak more closely about the nurture. We're actually about to embark on an evaluation. We have to evaluate the current units in order to dictate future policy. Does it work? What's the best thing about it? And what we're going to do there is actually, we can't just simply evaluate the units that have just been set up. They're part of it, but we need some historical data. So there are a number of schools who have had units in place, either self-funded or through extended schools, for quite a period of time. So we're using data from those schools, plus the schools who had been funded through DSD, Neighbourhood Renewal, and commissioning research there to look at the outcomes, not only short-term, but longer-term in the pupil's career. Nurture has the benefit of it follows a Boxall profile, so there's a lot of good data there. But I do know that DSD, I think, have recently done an evaluation of neighbourhood renewal, and we are obliged in the department, as you'll know, in the PAC, whenever we do a strategy or an initiative, we do have to do an evaluation of it to prove that it's been effective and value for money.
Well, and then obviously, with the impending stuff around the reform of the common funding formula, some of these schools in the areas that we're referring to today are going to receive a substantial increase in their money available to them. And I know it's the Sutton Trust that done an awful lot of work around providing a suite of maybe measures, good practice measures they can pick from. Yeah. Will the department be working closely then with schools to say, look, you have a particular problem here with absenteeism, that certainly feeds into low levels of achievement and attainment. These are a range of suites of... Well,
that's right. I mean, some of the... we referred to the McClure Waters report earlier, and one of its recommendations was not only should we be doing networking, providing guidance, but even the guidance that comes out has to also allow schools to evaluate and monitor how effective their interventions are. So definitely I think that's something that we'll be building in moving forward.
And of course, built into that, I presume, is accountability too. So if the schools, if the numbers aren't going up or attendance-wise, pressure will be applied to say, what's going on. And maybe that's where the DIs
maybe that's through yeah.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Can I touch briefly then on the area learning communities and what role they play in the sharing of good practice around attendance?
Yes, I mean, I said earlier I'd met with the 30 area learning communities, but all post-primary obviously, and they do have a whole range of subgroups, and they're sharing good practice. I have to be honest and say that when I was discussing, we were largely focusing around education and attainment and leadership. Those were the two core themes. But I was left with a very strong impression that there is very, very good informal sharing of good practice taking place. If I could put the clock back now and the benefit of the report and the discussion we've had this afternoon, it is that point about we need to be more explicit about attendance. That perhaps, although we've been relentless about attainment, we need to be more overt, as Claire said, more overt about attendance and really holding all of ourselves to account specifically around attendance. So, long story cut short, as we develop now the rolling out of good practice, I think the area learning communities in the post-primary sector have a really good platform that we can exploit for that purpose.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm really glad to hear you say that, actually, around being explicit, because there is so much more to school than just the attainment, and you have to be there, of course, to get it. So that's certainly a positive. See, is there any work being done on international best practice and around attendance? I have no doubt that where it works best is where in societies maybe where the effects of poverty and social deprivation don't have the same sort of effect on their system that we do here. I recently looked at some of the social missions involved in Venezuela, and they've seemed to have a massive impact upon not just the effects of poverty but attendance in schools too. And they have certainly hinged around opening up schools to the community in the evening times, getting parents, grandparents, families involved in education at night. So in the morning, something as simple as the morning, the mother knew the value of education to make sure the child was out, or the father, whatever it might have been. So again, just something around.
The McClure Waters report, when we commissioned it, actually the first major section of that report, they actually did review for us good practice elsewhere. I mean, they looked obviously at England, Wales, Scotland and the South, but they also went further afield. I think they considered New Zealand, Canada, a number of other education systems with similar sort of systems to ourselves. So we do have that good data. Now, they did for us collate the best of the good practice elsewhere, the good practice going on in the schools on the ground, and their final report was very much, a summary of what exactly works across the world. But we can certainly follow up on, what's happening elsewhere as well.
Thanks for answering us.
Thank you, Chris. No other questions from members. Well, thank you, Mr. Sweeney and your team for coming here today. Indeed, it's been very helpful, and I'm sure you'll take away the comments that were made from the members also. We talked a lot about sharing of good practices, but we still ended up with this report, so that speaks for itself. You did your opening remarks, you talked about educational achievement, and I suppose a particular focus or onus on that. And I suppose in some ways absenteeism has been allowed to slip. So again, both are inextricably linked, so we can't take our eye on the ball on both either. So that has to be worked on. Today's session does indicate that there has been a marginal improvement in attendance rates since April, the last Audit Office report in 2004. But again, there is room for improvement, and there's many challenges ahead with yourself and your department in learning from that. So thank you to your team today for the contributions that you all have made. We'll consider the evidence now going forward and issue our report in due course. And I do know there are some outstanding pieces of information that we still require from yourselves. Our clerks here will work with you on those pieces of information. So again, we look forward to seeing further improvements in this area, and thank you again for attending here today.
Thanks. Chair, on behalf of my colleagues, can I thank you and the members for the courtesy you've shown us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, we're into agenda item 4, matters arising. We have a number of... Yeah. Okay. Kieran, do you want to... Kieran, just before we move on, in terms of matters arising, do you want to make any comments coming out of the session?
Yeah, I suppose I'm quite heartened by some Paul's comments, particularly around being explicit on absenteeism and I suppose the need for accountability. What struck me listening to the evidence is just the broad range of, policy options to deal with this problem. But I think to help keep focus on the issue, I think it's very important to dwell on the 20,000 children that miss more than 6 weeks per year. I suppose that has been masked by the average figures. So I think moving forward in terms of accountability is to see how that figure is going to be. The proof will be in the pudding, how things work and how that headline figure moves over the next number of years. That's probably the main comment I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kieran. Mike, we have Mike with us, Mike Brennan, in place of Fiona Hamill. You're very welcome, Mike.
Chair, can I ask?
Yeah. Yeah, you can ask Kieran.
Yeah, just on the education stuff, I know we made the comparison today with England. How do you think we rank in Europe with the young figures? Is there any would that be easy to extrapolate? Or?
We haven't looked explicitly in this report, but it's something we could come back to. Just maybe defer to the team and access to information over and above what we have in the report.
Okay. Okay.
So we haven't really gone beyond these islands on this particular data set.
Okay, no members, no other questions for Kieran? No. Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Yeah, Mike, do you want to make any comments yourself, just on what we've just heard?
Not really, Chair, just to say that there were a couple of action points in relation to additional information, so we'll just liaise with the department just to make sure that's fit.
Okay. Okay, that ends the evidence session on pupil attendance. Thanks for everybody involved in that. Moving swiftly on, I'm conscious of time and we don't want to go out of quorum. Members, agenda item 4 under matters arising. We have correspondence from the Committee on Procedures. We have correspondence from the chairperson of the Committee on Procedures, Mr Jerry Kelly. You will remember that the committee had wrote to the Committee on Procedures in January requesting that amendment be made to Standing Order 56 to more accurately reflect the functions and work of the PAC. Mr Kelly notes in this correspondence that legal advice was sought in regards to this, and indeed in light of this advice it was agreed that it would be appropriate to make the amendment on Standing Order 56.
Okay.
So Legal Services has suggested in a way in which the Standing Order could be amended to reflect this, and this is contained within your pack and indeed with Mr Kelly's letter, and that's at page 18 of your electronic text. So are members content to note that, or do they want to have a wee read over that? Are members content that the draft standing order suggested by the Legal Services Office is accepted? We would need to write back to the Committee on Procedures on that it's been accepted. Members agree to accept? Agreed. Okay, members, we have correspondence from Mike Brennan, which is the responses to the PAC request for further information on the MORs relating to decal management of major capital projects, the fire service and the use of locum doctors. So that's within your electronic packs. In these pieces of correspondence, Mr Brennan, who is responding on behalf of Ms Fiona Hamill is with us, I think. states that an MOR represents the formal and considered response of the Executive, and that any member wishing to raise a subsequent concern should do so with the relevant minister in the Assembly. And as you can see, Mr Brennan states that DFP is therefore not in a position to provide some of the information that has been requested by the committee, but confirms that the committee's correspondence has indeed been shared with the respective departments. Members may recall this issue was raised by the Treasury Officer of Accounts previously, but clarification on this issue is still being sought as such, and members will wish to consider how best to take the issue forward. It has been noted that the handling of such request is somewhat of a foggy area, and myself and the Deputy Chairperson will be meeting with the Finance Minister at the end of this month. And indeed, this is an issue that we propose to address with the Minister. So, does any other member want to make a comment on that? Or Clark? Are you okay, Lucia? Do you want to make a comment?
Well, only just that, really, as you said, it seems to be an issue that's come up before, you know, on a number of occasions with the committee, and I would say that, yes, there needs to be some clarification needed.
Yeah, Kieran or Mike, do you want to come back to the table, maybe? Or Mike, do you want to make a comment first? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, you know, as you say, this is an issue, a foggy issue that's been batted around really since about late 2011. And there was a significant exchange of letters back then about what happens post-MOR in terms of follow-up requests. As you say, you're meeting the Finance Minister with the Deputy Chair on the 25th, and I know this is one of the central issues to discuss. As you know, the previous Finance Minister, and certainly this Finance Minister and executive colleagues, take a very, very robust position that the MOR is the formal response on behalf of the executive to the Assembly, and therefore any follow-up action that the committee wants to pursue should be to the relevant minister on the floor of the Assembly. I think where the fogginess comes up, Chair, is that, and it's an issue obviously for yourself and the Deputy Chair to discuss with the Finance Minister, is that there are some issues where I think it's possible to provide, you know, for example, additional information if the committee requests it. For example, if you're looking for a factual data source or you're looking for the latest set of guidance, you know, I think that would be perfectly within the remit of officials to provide that to this committee. Where, for example, you know, the committee is seen, however, to be challenging the MOR or its interpretation, then it wouldn't really be proper for officials to comment on the established executive position. So I think the key issue for the meeting on the 25th is just to bring some clarity to that issue, the fogginess as you call it. But as I say, this minister, this Finance Minister and his colleagues, when they clear executive, his understanding is that's the final and formal position.
Okay. Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and I thank Mike for that clarification or attempt to clarify some areas in that. Sometimes when we get the MORs back, there's an indication of that we look for more clarification on some points, and unfortunately, whenever you go to the floor of the Assembly to ask a question relating to an area of specific spend, where because they have passed a certain amount of money over to another body, they believe they don't necessarily need to go into detail of that because they say, well, that's not really ours. And I asked a question yesterday which was worded in a very clear way because I wanted to actually delve into exactly where money was being spent. And the Minister for Justice, DOJ, because we could be dealing with that under this issue, DOJ proceeded to say, well, he couldn't really comment on that because it was already a matter of another body. The money was passed over to them. But I'm saying if there is an issue over spend and we're not happy at the detail, ministers hide under this some ministers seem to use the opportunity to say, well, look, we've passed that over and it's not our responsibility. That piece of money has been dealt with by another body. But if that body's funded from there, I think we should have fully open and transparent approach as to where it is coming from and what it's for. And we could be dealing with one under PSNI here for monies which is passed across to another company. You could extrapolate by doing a bit of delving into the figures, but we asked a fairly pointed question. On the basis of asking a fairly pointed question, we wanted a truthful and honest answer as to if they're billing it out at £7 an hour, or charging Northern Ireland Assembly £20 an hour, and they're paying somebody £7.50 an hour. You know, the difference, the £12.50 that they're putting into their pocket for their management of that. You know, that's the sort of detail that we'd looked for in one area. Yet, they don't feel that they have to tell us that. I think if it's public money, we should be totally open on it. And that's, unfortunately, I don't think it's always addressed whenever we get back in these things.
Well, without getting into the specific question you're referring to, what I would say is you shouldn't have that difficulty, because every pound that the Assembly approves through the budget build process, there's an accounting officer that should be able to stand up and say where that pound goes.
But why do ministers then hide under the umbrella of that is another issue? And the one I'm talking about was the Police Federation yesterday. I asked a question in relation to the Police Federation, £325,000 funded from the Northern Ireland Police Service budget directly to it, plus they employ four of their administration staff are employed not by the Federation but employed directly by the police to actually run that body and administer it. And on the basis of that, I asked that very pointed question, and the Minister for Justice actually didn't answer it and said, well, that's another body out there totally. It's not a get out of jail free card these guys are looking for. They just don't want to answer questions.
Well, that money passes through the DOJ vote, so
yes.
There's an accounting officer that has to stand over and explain where that money goes, and the Minister.
That's exactly right. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
I'm wondering on with that.
Thank you. No, I think, I mean, it's been the general duty of this committee to do follow up, and we expect that, and I suppose in some sense we're not going to be silenced either. But Kieran, do you want to make a comment?
I think it's important, Chair, to disentangle a number of different issues. This committee has an absolute interest in the follow-up of its own reports.
Yeah.
And of course, we had a session here today which was a follow-up on a 2004 report. So the committee, I think, expects answers where it's following up on its own recommendations. I think that's very clear, and there should be absolutely no ambiguity about that. Also, I think the committee has an interest where answers are not clear, where there's a fogginess in the answer, and there's a need for clarity in the answer, and the committee is absolutely within its right to press for that clarity. There are other scenarios which, for example, where maybe a recommendation isn't accepted, and I think that will happen from time to time. I think the vast majority of recommendations are accepted. I think the last count, well, high 80s, 90%, and that's good, but there'll be a small number not accepted. I think it would be a good process whether they're not accepted, and I think this is increasingly happening, that, well, we don't accept the recommendation. Here's the reason why. We have a better way of doing it, and that's absolutely fine. But we had some cases in the past where maybe it was a point blank, we don't accept the recommendation, but no rationale given. And thankfully that has improved. The other scenario is where maybe the department just doesn't agree with the recommendation, and there is a difference of opinion, and so that is a different matter. But I think it's important to disentangle those 3 or 4 different aspects.
Yeah, the difficulty here is the Auditor General says, is that there's no two single issues. One is white and one is black. There's a range of concerns here about how MORs are considered by the relevant ministers and the executive. And as Kieran mentioned, you know, if, for example, recommendations are rejected, you know, from a DFP's perspective, there has to be a clear logic and rationale set out why it's, you know, and things are improving and hopefully will continue to improve. Where there's, for example, a lack of clarity, in terms of why something is either partially accepted or not accepted. And for example, one that comes to mind is I think it was the decal major capital projects one, where there was an issue around the status of the introductory paragraph, and it was all about the implications behind that. It could have been expanded possibly, in looking at it in terms of to say that the key reason there was that the decal accounting officer had a duty to consider whether there was a breach of, I think it was the public contracts regulations. So there's an issue there with bringing clarity to some of the discussion, which may help to resolve this fogginess. But as I say, there is quite a fundamental issue here in terms, and we haven't, it's not resolved, and it'll come down to where you get to with the Finance Minister on the 25th as to the Executive's position in terms of a formal and final sign-off on an MOR. Follow up that there is still the possibility that the issues can be raised with the relevant minister on the floor of the Assembly.
Okay, well, that's clarification in some points. I appreciate DFP is a conduit for the MORs, but when it's cross-departmental, then it's still DFP?
Yes, DFP will work with the relevant minister in the relevant department, and that's what I'm saying. Hopefully some of these issues will diminish over time in terms of, for example, where recommendations are not accepted by departments. It will be in DFP's interest and the others to make sure that there's a logic or a rationale set out if that is the case, that brings comfort to the committee.
Okay. So, members, as I said, myself and the Deputy Chairperson will be meeting with the Finance Minister at the end of the month, and we will raise that also with them. Thanks, Mike, for that. Thank you. Members, we've also received correspondence from Mr Andrew McCormick on the PEC update on the safety of services provided by the HSC trusts in relation to our report in terms of the safety of services provided by the HSC trusts. You will remember that 4 out of the 14 recommendations that PAC made in the report requested that an update was provided to the committee within 6 months. The updates on these recommendations can be found at pages 31 to 43 of your electronic packs. Members, do you want to take a bit of time to read through them, or
next week?
You want to make? Are you happy? I mean, I'm sure you've all done your homework and read them anyway.
Have them here.
Yeah.
Richard, just in relation to the MOR letters to do with DECAL and the fire service, it states in the letters that they have been referred on or passed on to the relevant departments. So just in terms of closing that loop, could I suggest then that letters go to those relevant accounting officers, just so that the issues just don't fall through the net and that they're still addressed?
Okay, yeah, agreed. Yeah, okay. Okay, members, we've also received a piece of correspondence from Mr Sid McDowell on the DECAL management of major capital projects. You'll recall that before Christmas we requested Mr McDowell come before the committee in relation to the comments made through various media outlets regarding our report on the DECAL management of capital projects. The committee engaged in a series of correspondence with Mr McDowell to arrange this, and we now have received confirmation that Mr McDowell, along with Mr Philip Cheevers and Sir George Bean, will be attending the committee on the 2nd of April. So a copy of that response is also in your electronic packs at page 44. So we'll be coming on the 2nd of April, so are members content to note the correspondence in your electronic pack? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Members, we also have the Audit Office estimate 2014-15 in your electronic packs at pages 45 to 58. This is due to be considered at the next meeting of the Audit Committee, which will take place on the 25th of March. Kieran, do you want to speak to that, or are you?
Yes, I should speak to it. Yeah, the net resource requirement is 8.2 million for 14-15, and it's unchanged from the figure we set out in our corporate plan, which you did see a couple of months back. So the estimate's consistent with the plan that you've already seen.
Yeah.
So the bottom line figures are our gross resource requirement is 10.8 million, income of 2.6, and the net bid 8.2, and that's exactly the same as was in our corporate plan.
Okay. Okay, members.
Chair, just apologise for it's just in relation to next Wednesday. Understand that the House is sitting next Wednesday, but does that mean that we have to cancel the committee? Like, because there is the evidence session coming forward, or the cross-examination, Mr. McDowell, coming forward relatively quickly after that, and we need to get time to get some more preparation made, because we're several months ago from we actually dealt with that matter, and we're going to have to maybe revisit it and ensure that we have a plan of attack. Well, I'm using that term because that's what it will be. Upon the said individual, so I think we need to be sure. He's bringing along the other people, but we're really targeting him, you know, and I don't want to detract from that.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll arrange something before that. We're still in open session, so I'm just conscious that yes, you're quite right, Paul. I don't know what's the arrangements for next.
Business as usual until we see how plenary finishes on the Tuesday as to what.
But a number of us, it might not be everybody in the chamber at that time, so
I think we could well struggle for quorum. But if it does finish early, then we'll be free to go ahead with our meeting on Wednesday afternoon.
Wednesday will not finish early, but
and particularly if on Wednesday afternoon, if we're in votes,
there will be.
It'll be disaster.
It'll be later on, I think.
Well, I suppose we'll have to see how the week.
See how Tuesday goes.
How Tuesday goes.
But there's some of them are committee amendments, and some of them are ministerial amendments, and I think there's been widespread support in quite a few of them. So I don't know whether they'll just hold them all to the end and go through it.
If there's no votes on Tuesday, I think Wednesday we just all vote.
Trevor just said we can still discuss and decide on that on the 26th.
That's okay.
March, if there's still time.
Okay, yeah.
That's okay.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, members. So we're content to note the audit office estimates for 2014-15. Yes, and as I said, this will be considered at the next meeting of the audit committee. Okay, members, we'll now move into closed session to deal with the remainder of the items and matters arising. If that's okay.